My name is Marty Gunn. Welcome to the United States Environmental Protection Agency's National Emission Standards for Hazardous Air Pollutants for Reciprocating Internal Combustion Engines. So we're just going to call it RICE NESHAPs for the economy of things. The goals for today, this is a plan for today. Number one, let's talk about the background. What I need to do is just establish a foundation so we're all talking about the same thing, so we're not confusing apples with oranges. Then we'll go into the regulatory requirements one by one. We're going to follow that up with a sister regulation to the RICE NESHAP, which is the Internal Combustion Engine New Source Performance Standard, and we'll finish things up with compliance. So first, and I like to open up with the purpose of the regulation because this kind of encapsulates it all. The purpose is to minimize or reduce the emission of hazardous air pollutants from stationary internal combustion engines at major and area sources. Now, towards that purpose, the methods that are in the regulation are this: operational limits. Operational limits primarily are hour limitations placed on engines that have no numeric emission limitations. Then you have engines with numeric emission limitations. So those limitations are either in the form of a concentration limitation or a % of reduction, typically across some type of a control device. And then finally, and this is the kicker, is demonstration of initial compliance and continuous compliance is the responsibility of the owner-operator. So when I'm talking to owners and operators, I try to explain the rules of evidence. Evidence is something that separates fact from fiction. Evidence is something that separates facts from conjecture. And how do you do that? You do that with something, typically physical or first-hand testimony, that says this is true as opposed to maybe being true or absolutely not being true. So it's incumbent upon the source, the owner-operators of these engines, to build what I call a document portfolio, whether it be in electronic form or hard copy form, that when some person with authority, and San Diego Air Pollution Control District has delegated authority over the RICE NESHAP, so when somebody with authority comes in and wants to discuss or determine initial and or continuous compliance, they can break out this portfolio, whether it be electronic or hard copy, and say, here's all the documentation. And when I'm explaining this, it's just like, I'm not sure if you've ever been to court, hopefully you've never been a defendant, but maybe you've testified in court on a case, or you've been a juror or something. When you go in there, evidence has foundation. You put the evidence in context. It tells a whole story in and of itself. It's not, I was here on October 1st of 2007. You just don't say that. You have to put everything in context. So the onus of demonstrating initial and continuous compliance is upon the source, the owner, and the operator. The other thing is the hazardous air pollutants that this rule is targeting. Primarily formaldehyde, acetaldehyde, acrolein, methanol, and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. We're going to talk about what engines it applies to and the difference between major and area sources. This regulation, like many regulations, has a history. It just didn't all magically appear one day. It happened over a chronology of events. So back in 2004, they initially established a regulation to cover existing, new, and reconstructed engines greater than 500 horsepower at major sources. And I call this the low-hanging fruit. So more often than not, it's the larger engines that emit greater volumes of pollutants than smaller engines, and major sources typically emit greater amounts of pollutants than area sources. So it made sense there. Well, under the Clean Air Act, that's how they got the ball rolling, but the requirements continued to grow. So they expanded the rule in 2008 to include additional engines at major sources, and then new stationary engines at area sources. Then finally, at 2010, they filled in the blanks, all the gaps. Whatever engines weren't covered under the 2004 or the 2008 rule, they included in the 2010 rule. The reason this is important is that the rule doesn't flow real smoothly. when you read it, it's almost like different people wrote it at different times, and they even use different terminologies for the exact same thing throughout the rule. And if it's why initially it'll frustrate you, but you got to understand this is it. I mean, it's taken place over a long period of time. The person who's in charge of it now, she's a great person, Melanie King from US EPA. She hasn't had the rule forever. Somebody had it before her. Well, that person retired, and she was working for private industry, interpreting the rule for them, and then she got an opportunity to go work for EPA. And that's the way it happened. So you have a lot of different cooks in the kitchen. The purposes remain the same, just how they get to achieve those purposes within the confines of the Clean Air Act somewhat changed over a period of time. So let's talk about some terms and definitions, and this will make the entire presentation more economical over the morning. So we're going to talk about what a stationary RICE is, what different types of engines are, what an emergency engine is, what commenced reconstruction and or commenced construction means, and then finally what you need to know, especially as regulators, is in the regulations themselves, as most regulations have, they have a whole series of definitions. So oftentimes when people call me up with questions and they're reading the same sentence or the same section over and over and over again, they don't understand it. Oftentimes the key to unlock the puzzle is in the definitions. So the definitions, you think, well, it's just to define a term, and I know what that term means. Well, oftentimes there might be a sentence or two, or even sometimes a word or two in there that actually is part of the regulation itself. So I always encourage people to read the definitions very closely and go back and refer to them. Maybe keep them separate, so as you're reading the regulations, you can have a separate copy of definitions, go back and forth and refer to them. There are also additional definitions in what they call Subpart A. Subpart A are the general provisions. We're going to go over this in a second, but they're the general provisions for all NESHAPs. So they have a whole nother series of definitions that are oftentimes helpful in deciphering the regulation. So stationary RICE, you would think it's pretty self-explanatory, huh? It's fixed at one place, right? It's established in one area to do one function. So that's one way of looking at a stationary RICE, but in order to get a complete story of what a stationary RICE is, you have to know what it isn't. It isn't mobile. The definition from EPA's point of view, and from most people's point of view, mobile is something that's self-propelled, so it's a motor that probably does work, but also propels the piece of equipment that does the work. And or it requires propulsion, someone to propel it to do the work. The easiest definition would be a lawnmower. So a lawnmower isn't stationary. You just can't, I would love this. Wouldn't it be great if you could just start your lawnmower up, go in the house and have a beer on a Saturday? But you can't, right? You got to push it around to cover the entire area. So any engine that does work that requires it to be moved around to perform its function is also considered mobile and therefore not stationary. Another way of looking at it, it's not portable. Sometimes portability is unbelievably easy to see. It's a little handheld engine with a handle, and you pick it up and you go over here and use the compressor, or you go over here and pump out some water, or you go over there and generate some electricity. So they're portable. You can see it by a handle, and it goes to many places to do its function. Sometimes it has wheels. So at the Cal EPA building in Sacramento, once a week or once every couple of weeks, I see the people out in the open area, and they have these internal combustion engines. They're on carts, and they're vacuum cleaners, so they're vacuuming up all the leaves and debris to make the entrance area look pretty. So that's another thing of portability. It may have wheels in terms of being pulled by another device that's self-propelled, so a trailer. And then finally, where it starts getting a little sketchy are the really big portable engines that are on skids. So they're just on plates that they're taken off perhaps a truck or a flatbed trailer with a crane or a forklift, and they're set down. And after a while, they've been there for a while, they accumulate things around them, and it's not so easy to see that they're portable. When it comes down to portability, it's much like the PERP rule. If it stays in one location for 12 months, it becomes stationary. I don't care if it has a handle on it. It can have all the wheels in the world on it. It can have beautiful skids. It can have cables on it, ready for a crane to pick it up. But if it's been sitting there for 12 months, it becomes stationary. And the big issue is this. Once it becomes stationary, it should have been in compliance the day it showed up 12 months ago. So it's really important to tell people who are managing their engines, make sure you keep track of what's supposed to be portable, because if one falls through the cracks, one falls off the radar screen, then you could potentially have an enforcement action going back a year because you just turned a portable engine into a stationary engine. One other caveat is a season. If an engine stays at one location for a season, whether it be an agricultural harvesting season, some type of fishing season, whatever the case may be, that's also considered a stationary engine, even though it's not 12 months. So there you have stationary. Then we have alphabet soup. FSRB, FSLB, 2SLB, CI, SI. So we have 4-stroke rich burn, 4-stroke lean burn, 2-stroke lean burn, compression ignited engines, spark ignited engines. A lot of different engines. This rule covers them all, so let's break them down a little bit. First of all, 2-stroke as opposed to 4-stroke. This rule is a reciprocating internal combustion engine rule. So reciprocating means we have a piston going up and down inside of a cylinder. The piston's connected to a crankshaft, and the crankshaft is what converts that reciprocating motion into rotational motion. The crankshaft is going to go outside the engine, be connected to a coupler. The coupler is going to be connected to a generator, compressor, pump, whatever the case may be. It's going to transmit the power to that compressor, pump, or whatever the case may be. And there's also a flywheel to store whatever surplus energy we have in the form of centrifugal energy. So in terms of strokes, each stroke of a piston is 180 degrees of crankshaft rotation. Well, a 2-stroke engine completes an entire combustion cycle in 2 strokes of the piston, or 360 degrees, 1 rotation of crankshaft rotation. So on the larger engines, a stroke is when a piston goes from the bottom of its throw to the top of its throw, or vice versa, from the top of its throw to the bottom of its throw, often referred to as bottom dead center to top dead center, or top dead center to bottom dead center. So many larger 2-stroke engines, on the upward stroke, the first half of the upward stroke, or 90 degrees of crankshaft rotation, it draws the working fluid into the combustion chamber. The second half of the upward stroke, another 90 degrees of crankshaft rotation, it's going to compress the working fluid, minimally air, maybe air and fuel, and prepare that working fluid for combustion. So that's 1 stroke. Then when that piston rounds top dead center and now it's preparing for the downward stroke, the first half of the downward stroke is the power stroke. So now we've started combustion, we're converting chemical energy into heat energy, rapidly expanding gases, putting pressure on top of the piston, putting energy on top of the piston, ultimately in the crankshaft, into the flywheel, and to whatever piece of equipment it's coupled up to. So half of that downward stroke is the power stroke, and the final 90 degrees of crankshaft rotation, the last half of the downward stroke, is going to be the exhaust stroke, where it's going to scavenge all the spent exhaust gases out of the combustion chamber, get rid of them, and prepare the cycle to be repeated again. That's a 2-stroke engine. Then you have a 4-stroke engine, and it's not hard to figure out. It does the same thing, but it takes 4 strokes, which is 720 degrees of crankshaft rotation. 1 complete downward stroke to draw in the working fluid, 1 complete upward stroke to compress that working fluid and prepare it for combustion, another complete downward stroke to convert after the chemical energy is turned into heat energy, it's putting pressure on the piston, the power stroke, and then finally 1 final upward stroke to push out all the spent exhaust gases out and prepare the engine to repeat the cycle over again. So having said all of that, what's the difference between a 2-stroke engine and a 4-stroke engine? Here's the practical matter of it. If you took 2 similar size engines, 1 2-stroke and 1 4-stroke, and operated them at the exact same engine speed, theoretically on paper, that 2-stroke engine could produce probably twice as much power as that 4-stroke cycle for the same given engine speed, which means the same given amount of fuel. So if you're an owner-operator, boy, that 2-stroke engine looks really, really attractive, because it's very, very economical. And depending on the size of the engine, it can have many fewer moving components. So the durability could be, and the maintenance could be better. Well, the flip side of that is it's not impossible, but it's much more challenging to make a 2-stroke engine run as clean as you can make a 4-stroke engine run. Because if that wasn't the case, if it was just all the positive side, that two-stroke engines provide more power more economically, we'd all be driving cars with two-stroke engines. Who here has a car with a two-stroke engine? They made them, but they haven't made them for a long, long time. So the fact of the matter is, they do sell really clean two-stroke engines, especially for pleasure craft. You get some Mercury outboard two-stroke motors, unbelievably clean, but still a lot of lakes won't let them on there, regardless of how clean they are, because just of the name two-stroke makes the Air Resources Board shiver when they hear two-stroke engines. Here's the other thing about two-stroke and four-stroke engines. They can be gaseous fired, they can be diesel fired, makes no difference. And we haven't even got to spark ignited or compression ignited engines yet. So that's the difference between two-stroke and four-stroke. How about rich burn and lean burn? A more accurate term for a rich burn engine is a stoichiometric burn engine. And what stoichiometry refers to is that you have the perfect ratio of air to fuel. More accurately stated, you have the perfect ratio of oxygen molecules to hydrocarbon molecules, more specifically hydrogen and carbon molecules. Because if you run a stoichiometric air-fuel mixture, you have the highest likelihood of complete combustion. And the byproducts of complete combustion, when you completely oxidize hydrogen and carbon, is water and carbon dioxide. So that being the case, rich burn engines or stoichiometric burn engines, when they get done with the combustion process, have very, very low levels of oxygen, as opposed to a lean burn engine. A lean burn engine, just by its name, runs a very high surplus of oxygen through the combustion chamber. It's a form of what they call low temperature combustion. You know, I said perfect combustion in a stoichiometric burn engine results in water and CO2. That's half the story. In an internal combustion engine, the temperatures that you typically see in a normal combustion engines are very high, and they exceed 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, right around 2,500 degrees and greater temperatures, you have air in the combustion chamber, because that's what you drew in on your intake stroke. Air is made up of 78% nitrogen and 21% oxygen. Well, you also oxidize nitrogen. And when you oxidize nitrogen, what do you get? NOx. That being the case, there's a goal, or there's a desire to lower the temperature, because for every degree that you can lower the temperature of combustion, you can lower the rate at which you're creating NOx. So on lean burn engines, what they do is they run a big surplus of oxygen. That means they're running less fuel. If you take an engine and you combust or explode less fuel, it will explode with less intensity. Think of a firecracker. If I sat a firecracker on the edge of this table and lit it, when it exploded, it would give off a certain amount of pressure and a certain amount of noise, percussion and noise. But if I took the same firecracker and emptied out a substantial amount of the gunpowder in it and lit it, exploded it, it would put out a lot less noise and it would give off less pressure. Well, that's exactly what a lean burn engine does. So if you can get a lean burn engine up to speed and load and run a lot of surplus oxygen in it, that means you're running less fuel, and when you're running less fuel, your combustion temperatures go down. So we have a whole bunch of owner-operators out there buying lean burn engines because they're concerned about NOx, right? That's not their agenda. Their big agenda is it burns less fuel. It's way more economical. Your automobiles today, when you're driving around town, they're stoichiometric burn engines. When you get to freeway speeds, they slowly transition over to lean burn engines, 16 to 23 to 1 air-fuel ratios, because it gives you better fuel economy. The government's happy because it gets better CAFE standards, corporate average fuel economy standards, and the government's happy because it gets lower emissions. So there's a difference between rich burn and lean burn engines. Lean burn engines are very attractive to the industry because they get much better economy. In some cases, it helps them conform to emission standards. In many cases, it helps them conform to emission standards. But they're substantially different in that they have lots of surplus oxygen coming out the stack of that engine. And the difference between a rich burn engine and a lean burn engine, rich burn engines have very little oxygen coming out that stack. Lean burn engines have a lot of oxygen. That's going to affect the control devices, our options in terms of control devices for those engines. Then we have compression ignited engines versus spark ignited engines. The definition,
So, like the car engine you were just talking about there, it can operate sometimes in rich burn and sometimes in lean burn. How would you classify it if that engine was a stationary engine for this? Would you call it a
That's an interesting question. I went and visited one power plant, and they have compression-ignited engines that run off natural gas. This power company also sells natural gas. So they have this engine that runs off natural gas. But the engine has the ability to run off pure diesel. And because it also has the ability to run off pure diesel, EPA said that you have to consider it a diesel compression-ignited engine. So I guess they're going to consider it to be worst case scenario, and so worst case scenario is going to be whatever that question is, because there's plus and minuses on both sides of rich burn, lean burn. It's kind of a sketchy way to answer your question, but it's the best way I can figure out how to do it. Okay, so let's talk about compression ignited versus spark ignited engines. Definition of a compression ignited engine is that the sole source of the combustion, the beginning of combustion, is heat generated through compression. So right now we have ambient air, 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen at about 14.5 pounds of pressure, atmospheric pressure. And all these nitrogen and oxygen molecules are dancing around, and I classify it as ballroom dancing because there's just lots of space in between them and everything's good. Well, if we draw this volume of nitrogen and oxygen into a combustion chamber and we compress it with the upward stroke of that piston, we compress it, what happens is we're forcing all these molecules very close to each other. And instead of being ballroom dancing, now it's a mosh pit. And everybody's rubbing up against each other and it's creating a lot of heat. Well, compression ignited engines use high compression engines, up to 20-to-1 compression engines. And because they're such high compression engines, they build a lot of heat during compression. They build enough heat where it actually exceeds the auto ignition point of the fuel that's being injected into the combustion chamber. Hence the name compression ignited. It's the heat from compression that ignites the fuel mixture and starts the combustion going. Whereas a spark ignited engine uses a spark plug. It has compression also, because it needs to prepare that working fluid to combust, but instead it only builds enough heat to come up to but stay under the auto ignition point of whatever fuel it's burning. So it doesn't want the heat of compression igniting and starting the combustion process. It wants a spark plug to do it, which is run off an electrical system. It's going to create a spark across the gap of a spark plug. And by the way, if compression ever does start combustion in your gasoline engine, that's when you hear pinging, or what they call pre-ignition, your engine rattling real heavy. So the difference between the two here is this: compression ignited engines are also lean burn engines. They're always lean burn engines, so they get real good fuel economy. Spark ignited engines aren't lean burn engines. They can either be lean burn engines or they can be rich burn engines. They're not classified as either one. So you can see all the dynamics here. You know, people say the rule's complicated, the rule's convoluted. Well, we have this chronology of events that changes the rule over a period of time, and then we have this unbelievable relationship between the engines. I kind of look at this as my family. I had 5 brothers and sisters, and mom, dad, grandmas and grandpas, cousins and aunts, and you get us all together for Thanksgiving or Christmas, and you never know what could happen. I mean, there's all kinds of dynamics going on here. Same thing here. You go onto a site, I've been on site visits, and you have some sites that run all types of these engines at one site. And those sites have to comply with this regulation. And each one of these engines, because of its unique characteristics, there's likelihood we'll have some unique requirements inside the regulation. Emergency RICE. The reason I'm defining this is that emergency engines don't have numeric emission limits. They have operational limits. They're limited to the amount of hours they run. And I really need to qualify this. They are not limited to the amount of hours they can run during an emergency. So if we have a Sandy event here in California and it's 2 months before the power's turned back on, those engines can run 24 hours a day the entire 2 months. But an emergency is an unforeseen, unplanned for occurrence or occasion that couldn't be avoided, such as fire, flood, loss of power. Maybe it's due to an earthquake, a tsunami. We don't have too many tornadoes or hurricanes or ice storms here, although it gets pretty icy where I'm at, but not so bad that it kills the power lines. So unlimited use for emergencies, but there are limitations on use for non-emergencies. And this is a recent change in the rule to harmonize it with our ATCM, at least relative to the compression ignited engines, but this change in the rule affects all engines. And what the change in the rule is that you're allowed to operate your engine up to a maximum of 100 hours per year for any combination of these 3 reasons. Reason number one, required maintenance checks and readiness testing. And the reason required is bolded and underlined is because required means required by somebody else other than you, meaning the engine manufacturer, the equipment manufacturer, if it's an emergency generator, the generator manufacturer, if it's an emergency pump, the pump manufacturer, maybe the system operator. So if you're part of some type of system and they want to tell you to check for readiness, you have to abide by their requirements for running the engine. So for maintenance checks and readiness testing, required. If you believe that there's a case that you need to run your engine more than 100 hours per year, you can petition the administrator. I'm not exactly sure how that works. I think you guys are the administrator. Some of these things, you'll see this in a few minutes, the EPA wants you to petition the regional office. And when I go to their presentations or talk to Melanie King, they're very vocal about this. In this case, they weren't vocal about it, so I'm not really sure if they want you to petition the APCD with the delegated authority or the regional office. But if a person feels that they have a need to operate at more than 100 hours per year for maintenance checks and readiness testing, they can petition. And then there's a caveat to that. If there's any state, federal, or local law that requires them to operate at more than 100 hours for maintenance checks or readiness testing, no petitions needed. But let's go back to evidence. The person needs to have evidence. They need to be able to show you the law or regulation in the section that requires them to operate that engine more than 100 hours per year for maintenance checks and readiness testing. That's one way of looking at the definition of an emergency RICE. The other way is, out of that 100 hours, the owner-operators can operate that engine 50 hours a year for whatever reason they want. And I'm being a little facetious, but the example I give is you have a colicky baby that won't go to sleep. The only way to put that kid to sleep is to put it next to that 10K generator while it's running. You have up to 50 hours a year to do that. It's up to you how you use that 50 hours a year. Now, there is a little issue here with the changes that just occurred on the 14th or 15th or whenever it was. For area sources, is they're allowing for that 50 hours a year to be used for non-emergency DRP use. Oh, we haven't talked about DRP use, have we? Did I skip over that? Bad me. Okay, let's talk about emergency DRP use. I should have bolded and underlined emergency DRP use. So demand response programs are when a power company has a relationship with somebody who owns a generator. And the relationship goes something like this. In an emergency situation, when electrical demand exceeds supply, a neighborhood's going to have their power turned off because there's not enough power to go around. So to avoid what they call brownouts, the power company establishes relationships with these people who own generators and say, hey, when we give you notification of this pending brownout, you folks fire up your generators. Either A, take your facility off the grid, freeing up that power to provide this neighborhood with power and avoid the blackout, and or B, you can plug your generators into the grid and contribute power to the grid. That's emergency demand response. So it has to be a proclamation from the power supply company. That's one of the conditions for the 100 hours a year. The last condition is it doesn't have to be a relationship between a power company and a person who owns a generator. But the power companies can say, hey, we have some major problem with our grid. Power's falling, voltage levels are falling greater than 5%, or frequency is falling greater than 5%. If they put that kind of announcement out, then owners of generators can fire up their engines as part of that 100 hours to help stabilize the grid. So that's the 100 hours. Then we go to the 50 hours. They can use 50 out of the 100, however they choose, or they can choose not to use the 50. It's up to them. But under this amendment to the regulation that just came out earlier this month, area sources are allowed to use that 50 hours for non-emergency demand response and or peak shaving. And peak shaving is just to save them money during the highest rates of the day, which are typically the afternoon and evening hours. But that only is allowed up until April 16th, 2017. I think, I'm not absolutely sure, I think they went back and did that amendment at the request of the power companies because there was existing agreements in place and they wanted to let all those agreements expire before the rule took effect. So that's the definition of emergency engines. Operate them as much as you want for emergencies. You're limited to 100 hours a year for required maintenance, emergency demand response, or problems with the grid, and 50 hours a year, however you want, area sources up until April 16, 2017 can use them for non-demand response and or peak shaving. Okay, there's a term in the Rice NESHAP, commenced construction, and another term, commenced reconstruction. So let's tackle commenced first. There's two ways of looking at commenced. One way of looking at commenced is that if you do work in-house, that means you have staff that can construct and install a source, which is an engine. If you do it in-house, it's when you begin a continuous program to construct. So you say, okay, next Monday, you're directing staff that you're going to start the construction of the new installation of an engine. That would be the definition of commenced. If you don't do the work in-house or you choose to contract it out, the definition is when you enter into a contractual obligation for a continuous program of construction or reconstruction. So if you do it yourself, the date you begin. If you contract it out, it's the date you enter into a contract. Construction, pretty self-explanatory. On-site fabrication, erection, or installation of an affected source. Reconstruction, not so self-explanatory. The definition under the Rice NESHAP for reconstruction is that the capital cost of components exceeds 50% of the cost of a comparable new engine. So that's going to be really rare when that happens. Because you're not talking parts and labor, you're just talking about components. Here's the other term here, technologically and economically feasible. I made an inquiry about what this meant, and it means this. Let's say you have an old engine, and you're going to rebuild this engine. You're going to do a major reconstruction to this engine. If it's possible, here's the thing with new and reconstructed engines as opposed to old existing engines. New and reconstructed engines have tighter emission standards. So if we have an old engine that was originally designed to emit a higher standard, and because of this construction and reconstruction clause, now it has to comply with a tighter emission standard, is it economically and technologically feasible? In certain instances, I'm more familiar with off-road engines, non-road engines, than stationary engines, but oftentimes they're identical, one and the same. A block, which is the outer case, the lower half of the engine, and the cylinder heads, over a period of time, the block and the cylinder heads remain the same. But changes are made to the internal components of the engine to make them comply with maybe tighter fuel economy standards and or emission standards. So in some cases for non-road engines, you can take an older existing block and cylinder heads and you can buy components to them that bring them up to a higher certification level. So that would be an example of when it's technologically and maybe economically feasible for reconstruction. But in many cases, especially with these big behemoth engines, I mean, I see some old Ingersoll Rand and Dresser engines that are back from the 50s. Nobody's making updated rebuild kits for these. So oftentimes it's not going to be economically or technologically feasible for reconstruction. But the definition is the capital cost of components exceeds 50% of the cost of a comparable new engine. We had a recent situation here in Southern California where this facility out in the middle of nowhere, so they were off the grid, they had an old worn out compression ignited engine providing power for the facility. It was no longer serviceable, so they went to a worldwide manufacturer of engines and equipment and bought a used, well, actually they're franchisees, and they bought a used engine. And the cost of that used engine did exceed 50% of the cost of a comparable new engine. So everybody was screaming, wow, you guys violated the Rice NESHAP because you shouldn't have done that. And then when it went to Region 9 for interpretation, Region 9 came back out and said, no, moving an engine is not construction or reconstruction. So buying an engine from a store, a used engine from a store, they moved it from the store to the new location, and that is not reconstruction. So moving an engine is not reconstruction or construction.
Quick question.
Yeah. We'll go in the back first and we'll go here.
Is the 50% of the reconstruction cost a single rebuild or remanufacture, or is that cumulative?
No. It's one continuous project. So the definition of construction is a continuous program of construction or reconstruction.
So what you're saying is somebody over the lifetime, a big number of 10 years, could do repairs multiple times and then go %?
Nope. So that's why it's going to be very, very rare. If you talk to Melanie King, at the time I talked to her, which was May, she knew of no instances where something had been deemed reconstructed. Because oftentimes they're going to do something, they're going to do it piecemeal. So maybe an engine needs a valve job. They're going to remove the heads, they're going to send off for a valve job. It comes back, maybe 6 months or a year later, it needs piston rings. So they're going to yank the pistons out and replace the piston rings. And they do it piecemeal. So it's very rare for someone to say, okay, I'm going to take this engine, I'm going to take it offline. And some of these older engines, you're talking all the parts have to be custom machined because the manufacturer no longer supports the engine. And it's a long, continuous process. So it's very rare where someone just says, okay, we're going to make this thing like new in one fell swoop. It's just not the way it works.
Yeah, so...
Oh, one more thing on his question. The cost of a control device does not contribute to that capital cost. So if you reconstruct it, and because of the tighter standard you have to put catalyst, that catalyst is not part of that 50% of capital cost.
Yeah, so going back to commenced construction, about the contractual obligation. So if I'm like a developer and I enter into a contract to build a building that's going to take 2 years to build, and that contractor is then going to go to an electrical contractor that's then going to supply the generator or the engine. Is it the date that the developer enters into a contract?
I would imagine so.
Contractor?
Because typically when you enter into a contract with a general contractor, they're responsible for everything. That's when it really happens. What happens between the contractor and if they subcontract that or not, that's something separate. So I would imagine, not being a contractual attorney, I would imagine it's when you enter into a contract for construction. So as part of your agreement with that general contractor, you are going to construct me a generator. How they do it, whether they do it themselves or through a general contractor, that's a different issue. All right. Okay, so let's summarize what we just talked about there. We went over the purpose. The purpose is to minimize or reduce emissions. Minimize means we're going to put operational limits. Reduce emissions means numeric emission values. Oftentimes that's going to require a catalyst from internal combustion engines at major sources and area sources. And it's the onus of the owner-operator to demonstrate initial and continuous compliance. The terms we talked about stationary engines. They're not mobile, they're not portable. We talked about emergency engines. Use them as much as you need to in an emergency, but you're limited for non-emergency use. We talked about the different types of engines. They're all internal combustion engines. They're all reciprocating engines, and yet they're so different from one another. And then we talked about commenced construction and reconstruction. Now let's talk about the regulatory requirements. It's important to have a copy of the regulation, especially this regulation, because there are so many versions, and they keep all these versions online so people can determine what their compliance requirements were at any given time during the life of the regulation. So it's important to have the latest and greatest set of regulations, so I explain how the regulation is organized. First of all, it's Title 40 of the Code of Federal Regulation. It's Part 63, and the subpart is Quad Z. You can get this through www.ecfr.gov. ECFR just means the electronic version of the Code of Federal Regulation. Now, when you go to ecfr.gov, it's going to ask you what title. It's a drop-down menu. You select Title 40. Then it's going to ask you what volume you want, because there's a whole bunch of Part 63s. You want the Part 63 that contains Quad Z, so you need to select Volume 14. That will take you to the proper Part 63 that contains Quad Z, and voila, you have it. You can save it as a bookmark, and you're good to go. Not only are sources and owners-operators subject to Quad Z, but they're also subject to the general provisions of a NESHAP. So general provisions are provisions that provide to all NESHAP, not just the ones covering reciprocating internal combustion engines. So the same thing, ECFR, Title 40, except for this time you're going to select Volume 10. Volume 10 contains Part 63 that has the general provisions under Subpart A. So if you bookmark both of those, you're going to have the regulation. So it's so encouraging when I was first given this project to start reading the regulation because all the section titles are questions. And I thought, wow, this is going to be set up like a frequently asked question document. What's the purpose of a frequently asked question document? To make it simpler, right? We usually write a complicated document, and to explain a complicated document, we publish a FAQ. So it looks like an FAQ, and maybe it's simple for you. It was a tough read for me. But let's take a look at the first one. Am I subject to this subpart? You are subject to this subpart if you own or operate a stationary rice of any size. 5 horsepower. I went and saw one engine that was 24,000 cubic inch displacement in excess of 30,000 horsepower. So from the smallest of an engine to an engine that cannot even come close to fitting in this room, this rule covers. Even engines less than 50 horsepower. Major and area sources. So the definition of an area source is any source that's not a major source. So the definition of a major source is any source that emits or could potentially emit greater than 10 tons per year of a hazardous air pollutant. Second definition is a source that emits or could potentially emit 25 tons per year of any combination of hazardous air pollutants. So those are the big emitters, and then any source that's not a major source is an area source. So it's covering all engines and all sources. Are there any exemptions? Yeah. One is an engine operated on a test cell or stand. This is specifically, and this is under the general provisions, this is specifically for engine manufacturers. And the theory is that engine manufacturers operate engines before they send them off to their distribution center. So if they're testing their engines before they ship them off, those engines are exempt from the regulation. All other engines operated on test cells or test stands are subject to the regulation. So if I'm in the business of manufacturing turbochargers, aftermarket turbochargers, and I have a whole wall bank full of engines, various engines to test my turbochargers before I ship them off to my distribution system, I'm a test cell, test stand, but I'm not exempt by the regulation. There might be one other regulation, and that is that if a rice is used for national security purposes, that the owner or operator of that rice can petition the regional EPA office. This is one of those instances where they're very specific that they need to petition the regional EPA office. Still under applicability. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Is there an R&D exemption?
A research and development exemption? The only exemption there is this. I suppose if they're using, the manufacturers using it for research and development, yes, but nobody else. And then a question came up in our stationary diesel ATCM. It specifically says training institutions. So if you're teaching students how to tear down engines and put them back together, they're exempt from our stationary diesel ATCM. There's no exemption here that says that, although Melanie alluded that there's some method to petition that under the general provisions, but she didn't allude to how or under what provision. So I don't know. They're pretty adamant on the only exemption is manufacturer test cells or test stands. So onward with applicability. Am I subject to this subpart? Stationary rice not subject to the subpart. Doesn't this mean exempt? So this applies to area sources with emergency engines that are either residential, commercial, or institutional. Now the reason they don't use the word exempt is because the definition of emergency engine is part of the regulation. So as long as the engine is emergency, so all the hours at once for emergency operation, limited to 100 hours for certain things, 50 hours out of that 100 hours for whatever you want. As long as it falls under that definition, it's okay, but that's why it's part of the regulation and not technically exempt. So if there's area sources that have emergency backup generators that are either residential, which means apartment complexes or homes, commercial, banks, stores, theaters, bars, all those kinds of places. And then finally, institutional. So institutional would be medical facilities, research facilities, educational facilities, primary, secondary, higher education, jails, police stations, fire stations, libraries. Those are all institutional. There's an address down here. It's like the longest document you've ever seen. It kind of defines everything that is and is not residential, commercial, and institutional. And what I infer by the length and size of this document is a lot of people try to get exempt under this. It's not subject to the regulation. So I imagine there's a lot of people that try to use this to get out of the regulation. What part of my plant does this subpart cover? Existing, new, and reconstructed engines at major and area sources. So let's define the difference between existing and new and reconstructed. Existing, as it applies to major sources, greater than 500 horsepower. If they were in place before December 19th, 2002, they're existing. For engines equal to or less than 500 horsepower, the magical date is June 12th, 2006. And this has to do with the chronology of the rule itself. So greater than 500 horsepower at a major source, if it was in place before December 19th, 2002, it's existing. Equal to or less than 500 horsepower at a major source, if it was in place before June 12, 2006, it's existing. Area sources, everything, all sizes of all engines that were there before June 12, 2006. So it's going to be incumbent upon, you got a difference, you got to know the difference. The standards for new and reconstructed are more stringent than standards for existing. So I would guess that it would be in the best interest of the source to say my engine's existing. So if there's a question whether it's existing or not, it's up to them to provide the paperwork or the evidence to show if it was there and being operated before these dates. And then the definition of new and reconstructed is the opposite of the definition of existing. So for major sources greater than 500 horsepower on or after December 19th, 2002, for engines equal to or less than 500 horsepower on or after June 12th, and all engines at an area source on or after June 12th, 2006. What part of my plant does this cover? Not cover. We have limited requirements, initial notifications only. So speaking in generalities, the regulation requires for some engines numeric emission limitations, other engines it requires operational limitations, other engine it requires work practice standards, the way you maintain your engine, other engines it has requirements for CEMS, continuous emission monitoring systems, or CPMS, continuous parameter monitoring systems. What this is saying is that there's a group of engines at major sources, the only requirement they have is an initial notification. Initial notification is, hey, I'm here and I exist. So new and reconstructed emergency engines greater than 500 horsepower, new and reconstructed limited use engines greater than 500 horsepower. The definition of limited use is they can only be used for a maximum of 100 hours per year. What's the definition of emergency? They can only be used for a maximum of 100 hours per year, right? What's the diff? Emergency engines can be used as much as you want in an emergency. Limited use can't. They can only be used a maximum of 100 hours per year. So the requirements are a little bit different in other categories. In this category, the only requirement they have is an initial notification. That's already taken place by the existence of a permit with you. Okay, so here are limited requirements, no requirements in subpart quad Z or A. So this is just like the last one. The definition of these engines are in quad Z, but they have no other requirements in quad Z or the general provisions of quad A. So a lot of these are major sources. I'm going to ask you right now to take a look at your handout, the color handout. I call it the cheat sheet. This is the cheat sheet provided by US EPA. So if you take a look at the top left of the page, it's existing engines at major sources. You have a whole slew of engines that have no standards. That's the engines that this limited exemption is talking about. So they have no requirements under quad Z. Other engines either have work practice standards or what they call management practice standards, or they have operational limits. Other engines have numeric emission limits. Some of the engines on this cheat sheet with numeric emission limits are highlighted in yellow and some aren't. The ones highlighted in yellow are anticipated to require a control device, a catalyst of some kind. Although, with the exception of one group of engines, the regulation doesn't mandate catalyst. It just says you have to achieve these emission limits. And because they're lower than what the average are for all those engines, it's anticipated you'll need to add some type of control device. So when we talk about all these little limited exemptions, partial requirements under the regulation, no requirements under the regulation, it's much easier to refer to this cheat sheet than it is to try to remember all these groups of engines. And then Dustin has another cheat sheet there. So you have a couple of cheat sheets there, so you don't have to remember all these weird little unique groups of engines. Then we have a group of engines, and your cheat sheet will help with this as well. They have no requirements under the RICE NESHAP. They are only subject to the IC NSPS, the Internal Combustion New Source Performance Standards. So again, it's on your sheet. If you take a look at area sources, all new and reconstructed engines at area sources are only subject to the IC NSPS. When you look at new and reconstructed engines for major sources, some engines have requirements under the RICE NESHAP, some engines don't. The engines that have requirements under the RICE NESHAP, many of those are going to require control devices. And here's a few more engines. They're kind of all over the place for major sources. All right, so that was applicability. Who and what does this rule apply to? All stationary engines of all sizes at major sources, and then at area sources, which is all sources that are not major sources, so we're pretty much saying all sources, new, reconstructed, and existing sources. So existing engines greater than 500 horsepower at major sources before December 19th of 2002, existing engines that are equal to or less than 500 horsepower, or any engine at an area source. And then new or reconstructed engines are any engines that are not existing engines. Questions? Hearing none. Let's talk about compliance dates. There's probably 6 or 7 compliance dates that have passed. The 2 compliance dates that are looming on the horizon are May 3rd of this year for compression-ignited engines, October 19th of this year for spark-ignited engines. Although, whenever EPA does this presentation, they're very quick to mention that sources can apply for or petition for a 1-year extension. Because I think they also mention whenever they do a presentation that the deadline for notifications is long gone, and I think very few places have sent in notifications. And I think they gauge that by not all states and not all districts within states have delegation authority. So the regional offices were expecting these notifications to come in, and they didn't see the volume of notifications that matched their inventory of what engines are out there. So I think based on that, they also strongly suspect that there's going to be a large number of engines that don't meet compliance requirements or deadlines. And so they're really quick to say there's a process for going through a 1-year extension. Although they're not specific on whether they can go through the delegated authority or the regional office. On new engines, after the compliance deadline, the deadline is upon startup with one exception, area sources. If area sources commence construction or reconstruction while they were an area source, but before the project was completed they became a major source, they have 3 years to come into compliance. Although, if you take a look at that cheat sheet, oftentimes area sources, the requirements are more stringent than major sources. Why is that? Because the first rule was applied to major sources. And so they took a look at what the horizon looked like at that time, and they applied emission standards based on then. But then they had to reevaluate in 2008 and 2010, and they saw an increased number of newer engines and an increase in technology out there. So oftentimes there's more stringent requirements for area sources, so this 3-year extension might not always be advantageous. Then we get down to the nitty-gritty. The next 3 or 4 sections of the regulations are questions like this. What emission limitations, operating limitations, or other requirements apply to me if I'm this kind of a source and I own this kind of an engine? And again, because there's different sources, different engines, different fuels, it's all over the place. We would be here for days. So I'm going to encapsulate this by just giving you a general description of what the emission requirements are, the operational limitations are, other requirements are, and they're all in the tables. I said earlier that the second to the last section of the regulation was definitions. Well, the last definition, or the last section of the regulation are tables. And the last table is table 8. So how many tables are there? Like 15. Because we have, like, example here, we have table 1A and table 1B. These, table 1A is emission limitations for 4-stroke rich burn engines. Table 1B are operating limitations for 4-stroke rich burn engines. So there is a little method to their madness in terms of grouping these engines, because 4-stroke rich burn engines are unique in that they have very low amounts of oxygen coming out their stack. That being the case, 4-stroke rich burn engines that need to use a catalyst will likely use a non-selective catalyst, a 3-way catalyst, as opposed to lean burn engines. Here's table 2A for emission limitations, table 2B for operating limitations on lean burn spark ignited engines and compression ignited engines, because compression ignited engines are also lean burn engines. Well, lean burn engines have lots of surplus oxygen coming out of their stack. Therefore, they would not be candidates for non-selective catalyst. They would be candidates for oxidizing catalysts. So these are, their requirements are limited in these two tables. And then you have table 2C, which are requirements for existing compression ignited engines at major sources and spark ignited engines greater than 500 horsepower at major sources. Finally, 2D, requirements for existing RICE at area sources. But essentially, this is what these tables say. For emission limitations, remember the HAPs that we're trying to manage: formaldehyde, acetaldehyde, acrolein, methanol, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. Well, primarily the gas they want to measure is carbon monoxide. That's a criteria gas. What's up with that? We talked earlier, in a perfect world, if we achieve perfect combustion, we don't get any CO out of the stack, we only get CO2 and water. Well, CO is an indicator of combustion efficiency. So we never see perfect combustion. You're never going to see an engine that puts out, well, maybe never. Right now we see no engines that put out no CO. So to every degree that we fail to achieve perfect combustion, we start putting out carbon monoxide. So carbon monoxide is a really good indicator of combustion efficiency, the ability to oxidize things inside the combustion chamber. So carbon monoxide is a surrogate for most engines in the regulation. One exception up until recently has been 4-stroke rich burn engines. In your cheat sheet, it says 4-stroke rich burn engines have to comply with a formaldehyde limit. Well, this is problematic to the industry, because when the industry orders a source test for an internal combustion engine, source testers automatically think carbon monoxide, volatile organic compounds, hydrocarbons, oxides of nitrogen, qualifying gases of CO2 and oxygen. Nobody thinks of formaldehyde. So the industry came back and says, oh, come on, this is very burdensome to us. You got to change this. So with these recent updates on the 14th or 15th of this month, whatever the case may be, you're allowed to have a 30% hydrocarbon reduction for engines that used to require 76% formaldehyde reduction, and there's also a CO option for those engines. So in terms of carbon monoxide, there's two options. You know, people are always given options. One option is you have a concentration limit. So there's a parts per million value assigned to an engine. Another option for carbon monoxide would be a % reduction. And for the most part, they're giving you a % reduction because they're assuming you're using a control device. So they're going to measure carbon monoxide into a catalyst, carbon monoxide coming out of the catalyst. And if you achieve the % reduction requirements in your emission limitations, you're good to go. Just for your edification, for those formaldehyde limits, they were in parts per billion. Same thing. It's either concentration limits in terms of parts per billion or a % reduction across a control device. Then we have work practice standards and management practices. Two terms that mean the same thing, and this is because of the chronology of events. For the 2004 rule, they use work practice standards, and sometime between the 2008 and 2010 rule, they started using management practices. But what it essentially means are oil changes. So how do oil changes affect emissions? First of all, these are only for engines with no numeric emission limitations. So how does an oil change affect emissions?
Lets the parts move past each other. So
I guess it could reduce frictional losses in the engine. Here's the big thing, and we're going to talk about this a little later. This is why I include this now. All engines, you have the combustion chamber, and then it's typically at the top part of the engine, and you have the crankcase at the bottom part of the engine. And what separates the two is a piston and what they call sealing piston rings. And what the sealing piston rings are supposed to do is keep most of the oil down in the crankcase, so we don't allow oil into the crankcase and participate in combustion, and then keep combustion gases in the combustion chamber so they can be exhausted out of the stack instead of exhausted down to the crankcase. So that's what's supposed to happen in a perfect world, but it's not a perfect world. First of all, you want a little bit of what they call blow-by or seepage of oil because you need to lubricate the top of the combustion chamber. So in order to allow that small amount of oil to the very top of the piston, the very top piston ring, that means a certain amount of exhaust gases can go the other way. If oil can go this way, exhaust gases can go this way. And when exhaust gases go this way, they go down in your crankcase and they start commingling with your crankcase oil, your lube oil. And your lube oil is designed to accommodate a certain amount of this contamination, but it has a limitation. And after a certain limitation, it can't accommodate it anymore, and now you have all these crankcase vapors that contain some raw fuel and some partially oxidized fuel and some spent exhaust gases. Well, lots of engines, these crankcase gases go back into the engine to be reburned, recirculated. And so it's going to bias your air-fuel mixture. And if you bias your air-fuel mixture richer than was designed by the manufacturer or richer than designed by the emission limits, you're going to increase your emission limits. So it makes sense to incorporate that you change oil and filter periodically to keep this from happening. So they have management practice standards or work practice standards that say, yeah, some engines it's every 500 hours, some engines 1,000, some engines 1,440, and some engines 4,320 hours. All depends on the engine. In case I was at the city of San Jose, and we were talking about this management practice of changing your oil, and that the lead technician, the lead operator guy stood up, and he was just incensed. And he says, according to your cheat sheet, I have to change the oil on one of my engines every 500 hours. That engine holds over 100 gallons of oil. I'm not going to change that every 500 hours because that's just going to cost me a tremendous amount of money. Plus, it's totally unnecessary. So they added in an option for oil analysis on the same intervals, 500 hours, 1,000 hours, 1,440 hours, 4,320 hours, the same intervals that you would normally change your oil and filter. You can take a sample out, send it out to an oil analysis lab, wait for the report to come back. If the report comes back that the oil is in still good serviceable condition, you're good to go until the next interval. If the analysis comes back that says your oil is no longer in good serviceable condition according to the specifications and the regulation, then you have to change it within 2 days.
who picks the lab?
It's any lab.
Any lab?
Yeah. Oil analysis is standard in the industry. Truck drivers do it. So the manufacturer says, change the oil in my truck, however many, 22,000 miles. Well, that's a lot of money in a truck because it holds a lot of oil, big tractor trailers. And so they're allowed to take samples out and go send them out and have it done. So it's a standard industry practice. They all check for the same stuff. They inspect the air cleaner, replace as necessary. How does an air cleaner affect emissions?
Keeps airflow clean.
It keeps it clean, and also if it gets too plugged up with dirt and debris, it's a restriction, and that'll also starve it's called under-airing the engine. And it'll starve the engine for air, and the engine, drawing a vacuum, will replace that air that it's missing because of the plugged air filter with fuel. And it'll be a rich air fuel mixture. Again, high emissions. One thing I would stress to inspectors and even the regulated community is on your smaller engines, there's going to be this clear plastic bubble, like a little cylinder on the air cleaner housing. And it has minimally a green indicator and a red indicator, and sometimes in between it's yellow. And the theory is that you don't have to take the air cleaner cover off to inspect the air filter. If the pressure drop between the one side of the air filter to the other side of the air filter is too great, suggesting a plugged air filter, the indicator will move to yellow or red. Those indicators are junk. They never work. Never is a strong statement, but they're an unbelievably high number of times they do not work. So I was inspecting it, and that's what the person giving me the tour was showing me, the little bubble. I'd say, come on, guy, there's like one little wing nut. Take the top of the air cleaner off and look at it. And look at both sides of the air cleaner, because one side will typically be really clean. The other side can be unbelievably dirty. It's amazing how dirty they get. And then in other instances, an air cleaner, it doesn't even appear to be an air cleaner. Sometimes they have huge drums, like pools, outside of the building containing the engine, and it's full of marbles. Like some of the older people in this room will know. A marble's a little round glass thing, you used to play games with. It's full, and there's got to be 10,000 marbles in this thing, and they have water flowing over it. And not only is that the air cleaner, because whatever solids have to go through all these marbles, and the marbles are wet, and that's going to separate the solids from the air, but it also controls what they call the charge air temperature, which oftentimes is an emission control strategy for an engine. So sometimes you have little air filters that are just like your car air filters, little paper element, hold it up to the light and see if you can see through it. And sometimes your air filter assemblies are pretty complex items. But either way, if you're asking about this, you want to look at both sides of an air filter if you can, because they might just show you the clean side. One side will always be clean, no matter how dirty the air filter is. Or you can look at paperwork to see if they're inspecting it. Inspect all belts and hoses. I'm not sure what effect this has on emissions, although it might be a really good indicator of overall maintenance. If you go and you see some big bloated hose that's about to burst all over you, stay away from it. But it might also be an indicator to you that this facility is not maintaining their engines correctly. And the spark plugs. Most of us are very aware of spark plugs. They can have a huge effect on emissions, so whatever the manufacturer recommends or the regulation recommends, make sure the spark plugs are inspected and or replaced at those intervals. Here's another operational limitation. Startup, shutdown, sorry.
So just to confirm, if they're a residential, commercial, institutional, they don't have to do anything for practice.
Correct. They're exempt from the regulation except for the definition of area source and emergency. And that big list of residential, commercial, institutional. Startup, shutdown, and malfunction. These are for engines with numeric emission limitations, and this is what it says. There are no emission limitations during startup. Why?
It's typically very dirty anyway.
Yeah, perfect. Why is it dirty?
Catalyst.
One thing, the catalyst isn't warmed up. That's perfect. So catalysts are temperature-dependent animals. So while the engine's cold or the exhaust stream is cold, they are just unbelievably big, expensive bricks in the exhaust system that do nothing. And then the other side of the coin is the engine itself isn't clean during startup. There's this old adage, liquid fuel does not burn, only vaporized fuel burns. Well, it's the job of compression that builds all that heat to transition finely atomized liquid fuel into a vapor. Well, when your engine's cold and you have your compression stroke, as soon as you create a bunch of heat with compression, it's all absorbed by the big, huge mass of metal that is the engine block and that is the cylinder heads. And so you have this poor transition from a liquid to a vapor. You have lots of emissions, and it just wouldn't be fair to measure emissions during startup. So the limitations, since there are no emission limitations on startup and idle time are limited to 30 minutes. Now here's one thing, and maybe Dustin's read it, I don't see in the regulation where it says how you establish the 30 minutes, how the person proves it to you. So this was several questions from the industry yesterday. Well, how do I prove it? Many stationary engines, and in fact I can't think of a stationary engine I've ever seen, doesn't have an hour meter. So typically they'll have an hour meter. Lots of new stationary engines are all controlled by computer. It's in the computer programming. It's going to start up, and so many minutes after startup, it's going to apply the load, and off you go. So there's typically some way they can demonstrate it, but they just have to might be creative. But they have to manage it somehow. It's not a don't ask, don't tell policy. The regulation says you have to limit startup and idle time to 30 minutes. The question is, how do you do that? And they should have an intelligent answer for that. For shutdown and malfunction, emission limitations do apply. Here's the thing with shutdown. When we get back from a big trip in our car, we just pull in the driveway, pull in the garage, turn off the key and go in the house. No big deal. You got some big, huge behemoth engine that's been running under a heavy load for hours, days, weeks, months. You don't just pull the load off and turn off the engine, because you'll have some parts of the engine that are really hot and some part of the engines that are substantially cooler, and the temperature difference can have catastrophic events. So you got to remove the load, you got to bring the engine slowly back down to idle. The emission limits apply. So they just can't do it willy-nilly They have to do it either while they're monitoring a SIMS or CPMS, or they have to have some plan to do it. And typically it's not a problem because your catalyst stays hot. It doesn't cool off instantly. So as long as your catalyst is up to temperature, chances are astronomically high, your emissions are under control. But they just can't take the lid off the engine and dethrottle the engine and walk away and go have lunch. They can't do that. They have to do it in such a manner as they're meeting the emission limits during shutdown. And then malfunction. I find malfunction very interesting in the regulation because they define malfunction as not reasonably preventable. And they go on to say that there are reasons that you'll have deviations. Deviations are whenever you violate the regulation. So since we're talking about engines with numeric emission limits, a deviation is when you have excessive emissions. So they go on to say that if you have a deviation that's not caused by a malfunction, then it's basically caused through malmaintenance, which is pretty much saying the owner-operator is negligent. What I get from all this diatribe inside the regulations is that deviations are deviations. They're not going to be forgiven whether they come from malfunctions or from malmaintenance or negligence from the owner-operator. But in that they define the difference between the two, it somewhat suggests that malfunctions or deviations due to a malfunction are factors of mitigation. So it wasn't reasonably preventable. It happened. So it's incumbent upon the owner-operator to, number one, recognize that a deviation is occurring. Number two, do everything they do to limit the emissions of that deviation. And number three, that they correct that malfunction or whatever it is as soon as possible. And therefore, the same thing is true for deviations caused not by malfunctions, but those are not as excusable, therefore it's a factor of aggravation. The factor of aggravation is that this was foreseeable, and just through poor maintenance practices by your company, you had an emissions deviation. All right, another kind of operating limit or other requirement is a continuous parameter monitoring system. This is for engines with catalysts. One part of this continuous parameter monitoring system is temperature. So they want a temperature probe put at the inlet of the catalyst, and that the inlet temperature of the catalyst is supposed to be maintained between a minimum and a maximum temperature. So we establish that a minimum temperature is required because until a catalyst comes up to temperature, it doesn't do any good. What's the deal with the maximum temperature? Why are they concerned with not exceeding a maximum temperature for catalysts? And I believe there's two different specifications for spark-ignited and compression-ignited engines.
Destroy the catalyst.
Yeah, it hurts the catalyst. So if you run a catalyst a little bit too hot for a little bit too long of a period of time, you know, some of you older folks, you ever remember being at a car at highway speeds and climbing a grade and you could smell all this rotten egg odor? That's because you have a rich mixture going through a really hot catalyst, and it actually creates NOx inside the catalyst. So you're creating NOx above and beyond what the engine's creating. So that's not good. And then if you get a catalyst too hot for a short period of time, it sinters the surface. So like when we get a sunburn and the sunburn turns to blisters, sintering is like blisters on the surface of a catalyst, and it prevents the gases from coming in contact with the active sites on that catalyst. So it reduces the efficiency of the catalyst. And then finally, if a catalyst is allowed to get too hot for too long of a period of time, it melts down and turns into a really cool moon rock. I have a couple in my cubicle. They're beautiful. I'm glad I didn't have to pay for them. Someone just gave them to me, but whoever paid for them, they're nice pieces of art now, but they're useless as a catalyst because they just melt down and turn to goo. So there was discussion yesterday on there's an option to put an engine shutdown on your CPMS. So the expectation is that when you have some catastrophic event that's going to cause a deviation, you have to do whatever you can to minimize it. And one of your options is to connect an engine shutdown to your CPMS. That way, if you ever get into a catastrophic thermal event, it'll shut down your engine and try to save your catalyst. The other half of the CPMS is pressure monitoring across the catalyst. Catalysts are flow-through devices. If you hold a piece up, you can see right through it. If you had a little piece of wire in your hand, you can put a piece of wire right through it and come out the other end. So in the big scheme of things, they don't offer much back pressure to an exhaust system unless they start getting foreign material accumulating on their surface. Sometimes it's called face plugging. Face plugging for some engines, many engines, comes from when the engine starts burning too much oil. When you lose internal engine integrity because of bad piston rings, bad valve guides, a lot of oil is allowed to get in your combustion chamber. Some of it participates in combustion, much of it doesn't. And it'll go out the exhaust stream as some kind of a solid, and it'll accumulate on the face of the catalyst, making those small passageways smaller and smaller and smaller, and it starts building up back pressure between the catalyst and your engine. That's not good for your engine, but the regulation cares about it because it's not good for emissions. And then diesel engines, because there's a requirement for compression ignited engines to have catalyst, diesel engines put out particulate matter, which are solids. And so diesel engines are very prone to face plugging, even when there's nothing wrong with them, over a period of time, face plugging a catalyst. And that face plugging is just the accumulation of particulate matter on the front side of the catalyst, and if it doesn't burn off, then it's going to offer more back pressure. It's going to offer resistance for exhaust to flow through it, therefore more back pressure between. So what this says is that you can never increase back pressure or pressure drop across that catalyst more than 2 inches of water over the baseline test, which is your initial source test. A couple of caveats to this. The regulation's written from the perspective that much of the country has never thought about putting a catalyst on their engine until this regulation came out. Well, you come to California and lots of the engines have catalysts on them before they ever thought about this regulation. And they don't have a CPMS. Some do, but many of them don't, at least not ones that conform to the regulation. So now they don't have to install a catalyst because the engine already has a catalyst, but they're going to have to install a CPMS. One thing to think about is normally when people comply with this regulation, they're installing the catalyst, a brand new catalyst, and a brand new CPMS at the same time. So the catalyst is pristine. It's absolutely positively clean. So when you run your baseline pressure drop across that catalyst, it's going to be at its lowest point. It'll never be that low again because all catalysts build up a certain patina on them. If you establish your baseline on a catalyst that's been there for a while, and if it has any accumulation of debris on it, then it could skew your baseline reading. So it might be in the best interest of the owner-operator or the source to have that catalyst clean before they do this baseline test for this pressure drop. Another consideration is this requirement that they have to do this pressure drop monthly. The temperature test, it's every 15 minutes, and you calculate it, you present it as a 4-hour rolling average. The pressure drop is once monthly at 100% load plus or minus 10%. I went to a water district in the Central Valley, and this was just unbelievable to them. They say we have engines, and we fire up our engines, and they maintain a certain water pressure in our system to pump the water from the ground up into the water towers. And when the pressure ever gets too much, or the resistance ever gets too much, they just cut on more engines. They say none of our engines ever come close to operating at maximum horsepower plus or minus 10%. And in order to comply with this part of the regulation, they had to go find a junction, a junction, and put a plate there and deadhead the pressure. And they said that this just had everybody sitting on pins and needles because the pipes weren't made to have that much pressure. And they're afraid they're going to burst a pipe. There are other people that have compressors. If you have an internal combustion engine coupled with a compressor, the compressor is only rated at a certain engine speed. You just can't rev that engine up to whatever engine speed you want because A, you're either going to overspin the compressor, or B, you're going to create more air pressure than the tanks were made to hold, and you're going to explode a tank. So this requirement in the regulation to achieve 100% of the site rated horsepower plus or minus 10%, for some people is an onerous requirement. Other people don't think anything of it. They have load cells. They just say, here, let's go, not a problem. But other people, they just say, this is impossible. So I think this is one of the petitions that you have to go through the office for, the regional office. What fuel requirements must I meet if I own or operate an existing... Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so that the pressure drop across the catalyst, if my catalyst is also using particulate filter...
We're going to get to that.
Okay.
It's a whole other animal there. So what fuel requirements do I have if I operate an existing CI rice, a stationary CI rice? So here they have some qualifications. If it's non-emergency, non-black start, greater than 300 horsepower, less than 30 liters per cylinder. That means it's greater than 300 horsepower, but it's not one of the big behemoth engines. You have to use ultra-low sulfur diesel fuel. It goes on to say for those big behemoth engines that you can use 1,000 part per million diesel fuel. I visited a few sites with these big behemoth engines, and their districts didn't allow them to use 1,000 part per million diesel fuel. because we are very sensitive about SOx here in California. So minimally, if they're using ultra-low sulfur diesel fuel, they're allowed to. This regulation allows them, in certain instances, use something other than ultra-low sulfur diesel fuel, but California, it's probably not real likely. This is my favorite section of the regulation because this is everything. I didn't have to truncate one word of this. I just highlighted it, copied it, and pasted it. At all times, you must operate and maintain any affected source, including associated air pollution control equipment and monitoring equipment, in a manner consistent with safety and good air pollution control practices for minimizing emissions. I don't know, if I was writing a case, I think that would be in every one of my cases. So that kind of wraps it up, everything. Okay, so emission limitations. Although they're going after formaldehyde, they use CO as a surrogate in many instances, most instances, and in one instance at least, total hydrocarbon reduction. For operational limits, we talked earlier about hour limitations for emergency and limited use, but other operational limitations would be startup, shutdown, and malfunction, and continuous parameter operating systems, and then what type of fuel you use. Any questions on these requirements? Okay, by what date must I perform initial compliance performance test and or other initial compliance demonstrations? This is contained in tables 4 and 5 of the regulation. Tables 4 is all about methods that you're going to use to measure emissions and what the emission limits are. So the quick answer is 180 days after the compliance date of May 3rd or October 19th, depending on if it's a compression-ignited engine or a spark-ignited engine, and then 4-stroke lean burns between 250 and 500 horsepower to major source. They have 240 days, and it's due by October 19th. And you have this option, and Dustin alluded to this earlier. You can use a performance test that was conducted previously. Now, there's criteria for it. Number one, it has to be done as per Table 4. So it has to use whatever test methods are in Table 4. Number two, it has to be within 2 years. Number three, it has to be approved by your system administrator, which is, in this case, San Diego APCD. And number four, you can't have made any substantial changes to the way you use that engine. So all your processes have to be the same at the time you did that test previously to the time now that you want to use that to satisfy your initial performance test requirements. So that might be an option for you. When must I conduct subsequent performance tests? This is in Table 3. It talks about all kinds of what gases you're measuring and what the intervals are. For many engines, it's semi-annually, unless when you demonstrate compliance with 2 consecutive semi-annual tests, you can change to annual tests. And you can remain in the annual testing mode until you fail to demonstrate compliance through a performance test, at which time you go back to semi-annual. So the best answer is semi-annual until you demonstrate compliance 2 times consecutively, then you transition to annual. Yeah?
What if you, as far as source testing, prove like the last 3 years you've met this? Can you go to yearly on that, or 2 previous?
So the question is, can I use 2 previously performed source tests to get me into the annual mode? And I don't ever remember the regulation saying that. So they say that you can use 1 previous test as your initial. I would imagine if your engine falls under the semi-annual requirement, you use the previous test for your initial, and then you would have to use the subsequent one. I don't know that, but I suspect that to be true. And then for some very large engines, your compliance demonstrations happen every 8,760 hours or every 3 years, whichever comes first. And for some very large engines, it's 8,760 hours or every 5 years, whichever comes first. What performance tests must I use, or what other procedures must I use? These are outlined in Tables 3 and 4. Tables 3 and 4 tell you about the frequency of the tests, so how often you have to do them, semi-annually, annually, every 8,760 hours. Tons of test methods depending on which gas you're measuring and how you're trying to control it, whether it's concentration limits or percentage of reductions. Might be EPA test methods 1, 3, 4, 320, ASTM D6348-03, and there's tons of other tests. And then these tables also stipulate how the test is performed. So we talked about all these engines and these different numeric emission limits. We talked about a lot of apples and oranges. By using things such as oxygen, moisture content, what we're doing is we're converting everything into bananas. So everybody's on a level playing field in terms of establishing what their emission concentration limits are or what their percent reductions are. The table 3 and 4 also talk about sampling sites, so where you're actually taking the samples for, traverse points to make sure no one's sticking a probe in there and picking the cleanest part of the stack and using that as a representative sample of how the emissions putting out. There's a lot of specifics inside there. I highly recommend that you have a discussion with whoever's doing your source test to make sure they've read the tables and they're going to satisfy all the needs of the regulation. Here's probably the biggest part. Before break, we had the shortest section of the regulation. This is probably the most extensive part. This talks about what are your monitoring, installation, collection, operation, and maintenance requirements. And as you can see, they're pretty extensive. When it comes to continuous emission monitoring system, SEMS, they talk about the sampling site, so where you're going to put your probes in terms of your SEMS system. Then it talks about RADA tests, relative accuracy tests, audits. So these have to be performed, I believe, annually as part of a performance test. So when you have your source tester out there actually measuring the emissions coming out the stack, they're also verifying the accuracy of your SEMS tester. Then it talks about sampling frequency, so you can get your rolling averages to demonstrate your continuous compliance. And then back to the apples and oranges and bananas, there's a correction factor for oxygen, in some cases for SEMS for CO2, just to make sure that we're doing an accurate measurement and a representative sample. Then we have continuous parameter monitoring systems. This is a system where you're measuring catalyst inlet temperature and the pressure drop across the catalyst. This is pretty extensive. We had some questions during break about this. There are many engines out there, I'm guessing, that have catalysts on them that were put on before the owners and operators ever knew about this rule. And many of these catalysts have temperature thermocouplers, and they're measuring pressure in some cases. This is what the rule says. The rule has very specifics in terms of the placement of the first of all, the accuracy of the thermocoupler, the accuracy of the pressure transducer, the location of the thermocoupler, the location of the pressure transducers. So, and I alluded to this before, if you're buying a new system, that manufacturer, at least the ones I've talked to, they know what the rule requires and they have packages that satisfy the rules, and they'll come and customize them to whatever your specific stationary engine is. Then if you have one though that was already existing and you need to convert it, what you need to do is you need to confirm that it complies with all the requirements of this site-specific monitoring plan, all the specifications in terms of accuracy of the sensors, the placement of the sensors, and how you're collecting data. Once in this operating plan, if you read the requirements of the rule, it's pretty extensive. So I was just thinking myself, if I owned an engine, what would I do? And I'm thinking that a pre-done package where somebody's already got this plan already in place might be pretty attractive. It could be cumbersome in some instances, converting what you have to satisfy the rule. Once you have this monitoring plan in place, then you have to install, configure, operate, maintain the CPMS as per your site-specific plan. Collect data every 15 minutes. This is for temperature, so we're collecting temperature every 15 minutes, and in most cases, we're coming up with 4-hour rolling averages. Again, RADA test, relativity accuracy test, and performance evaluations minimally annually, and conduct performance evaluations as per the monitoring plan. So whatever your monitoring plan says in terms of evaluation test, that's what you have to do to comply with the regulation. So if you already have a system in place, that's good, but now you have to bring whatever system you have in place to comply with the requirements of the Rice NESHAP. How about for fuel usage? If you have an engine that's burning landfill and or digester gas, the definition of a landfill digester gas engine is that minimally 10% of the heat energy used comes from that gas. So you have to keep copious records of your fuel usage, including fuel rates and how you come up with the calculations to demonstrate that you're using the required amount of landfill and or digester gas. Non-resettable hour meters, primarily for emergency engines, because you have that 100-hour block that you can use for non-emergency purposes, for readiness checks and maintenance, for emergency demand response, and for fluctuations in voltage or frequency, and then you have 50 hours of that 100-hour block that you can use however you want. Well, in that you have those blocks and those stipulations, strongly says that you have to keep track every time you fire up that engine why you're firing up that engine. Is it for maintenance or readiness? Is it for emergency demand response? Is it for non-emergency demand response? Operate and maintain engine and control device as per manufacturer specifications. So this sounds like a no-brainer, but do you know what your engine manufacturer says about maintaining your engine? Many engine manufacturers, stationary engine manufacturers, mostly the older ones, as they got newer, they got more hip. Oftentimes with older stationary engines, they applied automotive specifications to their engine. So when does the automotive manufacturer, engine manufacturer, say you have to change your oil? Every 7,000 miles, maybe 7,500 miles. Sometimes every 3,000 miles if it's rough use. So make sure you know what your engine manufacturer says, and so you can demonstrate it should somebody ask. And if you work with your engine manufacturer and say, hey, it appears that you placed maintenance requirements that are not suited to the applicability of the engine and the stationary source, see if that manufacturer has alternative maintenance manufacturers. Same thing for whatever control devices you put on. Whatever they say, you just have the owner's manual. I do a lot of work with verified diesel emission control strategies, retrofit diesel particulate filters. They have owner's manuals and they tell you exactly the frequency at which they need to be removed from the engine and cleaned, or where pressure checks need to be done, etc. Crankcase controls. So I talked to you earlier about how engine oil gets contaminated because a certain amount of the exhaust gases in the combustion chamber seep past the piston rings and go into the crankcase, get mixed with the oil. Well, here's the thing. All engines do this. Way back, I think in probably 1964, for your automobile engines out there, they were all vented to the atmosphere. So they had something called a road draft tube, a metal pipe that came out of the side of your engine, and it went down to the bottom of the engine, and the theory was, as you were driving down the highway at 50, 60, 70 miles an hour, the air rushing by the opening of that tube would create a vacuum and draw out all those nasty gases from your crankcase, and they would just go out into the atmosphere. If you take a look at really old TV show or movies, they have that black heavy streak down the center of all the highways. That's because all the engines back there, the crankcases were vented, and a certain amount of oil came out of those tubes. Well, they figured this out in '64 for automobiles, and they made them redirect the gases back into the engine to get reburned. It's called a closed crankcase positive ventilation system. So they put them on cars a long time ago. The diesel industry hasn't caught on until very, very recently. So lots of times if you go into the engine room of a stationary diesel engine, you'll see a lot of oil contamination on the floor, at least on part of the engine. That's somewhat suggestive of an open crankcase system. So there's nasty gases in there, and they don't want those nasty gases going into the ambient air. So now there's a requirement for engines that did not come originally equipped with crankcase controls. Now they have to add those controls. There's two options. There's a closed system, which connects the ventilation port of the crankcase and redirects the gases back into the engine, and it's just a circular flow, and they're never allowed to escape into the atmosphere. And then there are open systems. Open systems are nothing more than like a trap. So think of like a plumbing trap that prevents certain gases from coming out of the plumbing system into your house. So they're like a trap that keeps all the solids, the metals, and the nasty gases, for the most part, in the engine, and only allows the clean air to come out of the engine. Not totally true, but somewhat true. So this is probably the one area of all the site visits I've done, this has been the one area where the owners and operators have been caught off guard. So they knew about the rule. They were complying with all the emission limitations and operational limitations, and they were absolutely clueless about having crankcase controls on their engines. So probably a good thing to look into. At one point, ARB would verify these devices. So they would be a VDEX, a level 1 verified diesel emission control strategy. I looked on our website. We still have a couple that are verified, but they're verified in conjunction with catalysts. So I don't think there's any standalone cyclonic PCV systems out there for diesels that are verified anymore, but there's tons of them available out there from reputable manufacturers, so that's what I would suggest. Startup time, we already talked about startup time. This is for engines with numeric emission limits, and then it's incumbent upon you to demonstrate this however you demonstrate it. There's no requirement that says you have to have a non-resettable hour meter for these engines to do it, but think of a way. There's oftentimes multiple monitoring systems on these engines. Think of a way you can translate some of that data to demonstrate that you're complying with the startup and idling time limitation. Oil analysis, we talked about oil analysis. What they're looking for is the ability of the oil to absorb and keep in suspension the contaminants from combustion. So looking for base numbers. So how dirty is the oil compared to how clean it was when it was new, or the total acid content, how much is it contaminated based on the contamination, which is none when it was new. The viscosity is how thick the oil is as measured through a predetermined amount of oil through a fixed orifice at a given temperature. So the theory is that as your oil gets older and older and older, it gets either thinner or it gets thicker. It's going to vary from whatever the viscosity specification was. And the moisture content. We've always heard that water and oil don't mix, right? Well, they do in the crankcase of an engine. It's not a good match, but they do. And so that's another thing they're going to be testing for is the water content of the oil. If your oil analysis comes back that it exceeds the specifications outlined in the regulation, you have 2 days to change the oil. How do I demonstrate initial compliance with emission limitations, operating limitations, and other requirements? So, number one, performance test. This is critical for demonstrating initial compliance with numeric emission values. But at the same time, you're going to, if there's a requirement that you have a SEM system at the same time that you're doing this performance test, you're going to have your SEM system on the engine and you're going to get that validated. And if there's a CPMS requirement for the engine, during your initial performance test, when you're demonstrating initial compliance, that's when you're going to do this. Ultimately, what you're going to do, though, is you're going to send in a notification. So what they're really asking you is, how are you going to communicate to us that you're in compliance initially with the regulation? Continuous Emission Monitoring System.
Thank you.
CPMS, Continuous Parameter Monitoring System. COMS, Continuous Operating Monitoring System. Opacity. Here they use Operating Monitoring System. How do I monitor and collect data to demonstrate continuous compliance? Well, you have to monitor the data at all times. When you read this section of the regulation, this is what I interpret from this section of the regulation. You have to have a SEM system, and it's not enough that you just put a SEM system on your engine. You have to somehow monitor the SEM system, and you have to somehow respond to any kind of a deviation that's been picked up by your SEM system. But what this section really says is that you have to extract from the data any errant data from your SEM system. So if you're putting your SEM system through some type of performance test, a SPAN test, maximum minimum, or any type of evaluation test, if you ever have a SEM system that goes out of control, one of your sensors goes bad, you have to extract that data out of the data that you're going to use to demonstrate continuous compliance. It's called pencil whipping. So if you just take all your data and say, okay, the inspector's going to be here next week, let's calculate all this up real quick, and you don't QA, QC your data, and they find out about it, well, garbage in results in garbage out. So if you're using your SEMS data to demonstrate continuous compliance and you haven't done any QA, QC, what they're telling you here is it's not good data. You haven't successfully demonstrated continuous compliance. We'll take you and then you.
Is there a specific set of parameters for the SEMS that's spelled out in the regulation?
There is. And it also points to the general requirements, which are Part 63, Subpart A.
Marty, this is John Gilliland. Does the regulation specify a data recovery efficiency minimum requirement for CPMS? 95%, 90%? So when you say you're pencil whipping, are you documenting that you're meeting a certain DRE, shall we say, data recovery efficiency?
So normally I would repeat his question. I'm not even sure if I understood the question well enough to repeat the question. But this is what I got from the question. Does the system require you to do any type of performance test on it that allows you the ability to extract out any bad data? And it does, because you have to have that on-site monitoring plan. That on-site monitoring plan has to have performance evaluations in between the annual performance evaluations done in conjunction with your performance tests.
Regulation specifies it's continuous. If you are missing certain data gaps because now you're not continuous, when does it actually become not continuous? So if you ran for 100 hours for a quarter, and 10 of those hours are missed, you have to pencil whip them in. So you have a data recovery efficiency of 90% for that quarter. Have I complied with the regulation?
I don't know. So now I understand the question. Is there a percentage that's forgivable? Is there an allowable shift in how much data you have collected? And I don't know the answer to that. I imagine there's lots of specifications for SEMS in the general requirements. So I imagine if they do exist, that's where they would be. But I don't know the answer off the top of my head. Yeah.
Now, I heard this QA/QC data. So from what I understand is I'm reporting data 8,000 hours a year, depending on how many hours I'm running. And if I have an event, I have to actually highlight that event and give that to them as this was an event, this was an event, and this was an event.
So his question is that you have to continuously monitor the operation of your engine, and if you have any, and his term was events, then you have to highlight them. And highlighting them means that you've documented them, and after you've documented them, you highlighted them. We're going to get to that in a second, but the answer is yes, absolutely. They're called deviations. And one last thing about the SEMS comment, I don't know how much you're allowed to have missing data, or if you're allowed to have any missing data, but the general requirements takes out of control SEMS data unbelievably serious. So your record keeping for the Quad Z RICE NESHAP is 5 years. When you read the general requirements for out of control SEMS, you keep all that data for as long as you own that engine, or for as long as that engine's covered by the regulation. So it seems to me in that they give so much weight to out of control SEMS data that any deviation that they might allow would be very minimal. Some other questions? Yeah.
In the previous slide, you outlined performance test and CPMS. Performance test include what kind of parameters?
So this slide says that how do you demonstrate initial compliance, and this is specific for engines that have numeric emission limitations. You're going to get a performance test. So here's the deal with performance test. You have to notify your administrator, which is in this case San Diego APCD, 60 days before your performance test, and your source tester gives them a plan. The source tester is going to tell them what they're going to measure and how they're going to measure it, and that's going to include the RADA test for the SEMS or the CPMS. So they submit the plan 60 days in advance. At this point, the administrator has the opportunity to review the plan and perhaps give you feedback. Although many districts are strapped for resources, so I'm not sure if they have the resources to review your plan and determine if it's good or not. But either way, at least you gave them the opportunity. So your source tester is going to figure out how they're going to test the SEMS and what specifications are either contained in Quad Z or Part A. And then they're going to do the test, assuming that the district hasn't responded to you, nor has showed up to observe the test. Then after the test is done, the source tester has, I think, 60 days after your compliance date to give them the report. So it's the specifications, to answer your question very long-windedly, the specifications are either going to be in Quad Z or Part A. Your source tester is going to extract out those requirements, put them into a plan. You're going to submit the plan to your administrator 60 days before. If you're lucky, the administrator will have a chance to review it and give input. If not, it is what it is. It either complies with the regulation or it doesn't. Okay, how do I demonstrate continuous compliance with emission limitations, operating limitations, and other requirements as per Table 6? So Table 6 is a pretty extensive table. This is, I found, very interesting. Deviations during the first 200 hours of a new or reconstructed engine operation not considered violations. So if you ever go and talk to facilities that do major engine overhauls, they say this, before we did the engine overhaul, except for seeing more and more wear, maybe blow by, maybe crankcase pressure, whatever the case may be, this engine was beautiful for emissions. And then we go in there and take the thing apart in a million pieces, put it back together, and we have all these failures immediately after putting the engine back together. And that's just the way it is. I mean, engines are complicated things. There's lots of nuts and bolts and lots of things that can go wrong, things that are overlooked when you put them back together. So at least the rule recognizes this. I'm guessing this was put in there from some input from industry. So you have to do performance tests as per Table 6, SEMS and CPMS data, continuous emission monitoring system, continuous parameter monitoring systems. You have to track engine hours, copious tracking of engine hours for engines that have operational limits. Emergency engines, limited use engines, and there are some instances for engines that are used less than 24 hours per year. Fuel usage, in the context of 2, I think this section actually mentions it in the context of landfill gas engines and digester gas engines. So you have to show the percentage of landfill or digester gas that you're using in conjunction with other fuels, but also make sure that you can demonstrate you're using ultra-low sulfur diesel fuel where it's required. Deviations, they're huge on deviations. So when you experience a deviation, you got to document when the deviation occurred, how long the deviation occurred, what you did to limit emissions, and what you ultimately did to solve the problem. That's the information they're going to use to figure out if it was a deviation from a malfunction or from some type of neglect from the owner-operator. Yeah.
Right, with Part 60 and 75 for the SEMS, they allow for makeup data. Depending on how continuous, if you're like 90 or 95% continuous operation, they allow for makeup data that way. So I'm wondering if maybe this is harmonized with that as well.
I don't know. Interesting.
Yeah.
And then maintenance, if you have maintenance requirements, so you have management practices or work practice standards that say you have to change oil every so often, inspect the air cleaner, belt hoses, whatever the case may be, or if you're obligated to maintain the engine as per engine manufacturer's specifications or control device specifications, keep all those maintenance records. So notifications, what's the difference between a notification, a report, and a record? A notification is when your administrator, EPA or the air district, is sitting there and they don't know what they don't know. So one way of looking at a notification is that if you have determined that you fall under this rule and you don't have one of those engines that's forgiven from notifications, is you send in a document to your administrator saying, hey, I have these engines. These are how the engines are operated. This is the processes they do. They're spark ignited, the compression ignited, rich burn, lean burn, 2-stroke, 4-stroke. This is how I think I fit into the rule. And it's your initial notification to your administrator, whoever that is. This is required for engines that have numeric emission limits. I visited one site and they had some really large pilot ignited natural gas engines. That means they're compression ignited engines, but they use a little bit of diesel fuel as a spark plug, and then the vast majority of the fuel used for combustion is natural gas. So they interpreted this as meaning they were spark ignited engines. So they sent their notification in this case to the Region 9, and Region 9 came back after reading this document and says, no, you don't fall under the definition of a compression ignited engine, plus you maintain this 50,000 gallon tank full of diesel fuel in case a tsunami hits your facility and it wipes out your natural gas supply. So you have the potential to run off 100% diesel. So that being the case, that's another thing that a notification does, is it allows you to communicate how you think that you apply to the rule applies to you, and it allows somebody else that knows about the rule to determine if your interpretation is accurate or not. So within 120 days of startup of a new or reconstructed RICE greater than 500 horsepower at a major source, and then the other one's also, this is for reconstructed emergency and limited use RICE at 500 horsepower at a major source. If these limited use and emergency use engines greater than 500 horsepower at a major source, they only have a notification requirement. So your requirement is to tell your administrator why you feel these are greater than 500 horsepower, why you feel they're emergency engines, and why you feel they're limited use engines.
Real quick, just our intent is for the initial notification. That's what your permit app is. So indicate on your permit app that here's what you think you are, here's what you need to do, whatever. We're not intending to have a second form derived from EPA that is called initial notification. So that is our intent on that. And then I think our normal source testing procedure would include a notice of a performance test, which would take care of the notice of performance test notification requirement, as well as the notification of compliance status. That's a part of our, did you pass the source test, yes or no? So those individual forms, we don't need individual forms filled out and submitted. That's a part of the permit process. But that initial notification is the initial application. So let us know, here's our engine, here's where we fall.
Here's my understanding of, go ahead.
Does the district notify Region 9?
As delegated, Region 9 does not get those forms. They go straight to us.
So here's how I understand the relationship between the delegated authorities, the districts in California that have delegated authority, and Region 9. Region 9 does not require redundant paperwork. So all the paperwork is going to be between you and your administrator, which if it is San Diego APCD, that's where the paperwork stays. There is a few exceptions to this. If you want to deviate from that 100% plus or minus 10% site rated horsepower, that has to go through Region 9, and there's a couple other ones I put up here. Oh, if you want to get an engine exempted because it's used for national security, that was a second reason. It seems to me there's one more reason. But besides that, there's no requirement for duplicative paperwork between the district and Region 9. Region 9 is just going to accept whatever you give to your administrator of the local district. And then finally there, we just talked about this notification to conduct an initial test. This gives the administrator the chance to review the plan and to show up and observe the test if they so choose. Then you have the notification of compliance status that Dustin just mentioned. It's due 30 days following the compliance demonstration for engines with no required performance test. This means engines without numeric emission limitations, and you're allowed 60 days following a compliance requirement that does require a performance test. So, and that's because it takes time for your source tester to compile the data and make it into a really pretty report form. And then here's a big one. So I just heard news today that EPA has published the revised rule, so 60 days from today, it'll take effect. So that takes us to what, the beginning of April? Well, one of the revisions was harmonizing the requirement under our state ATCM for ag engines. We require the agricultural operations operating Tier 1 and Tier 2 engines to upgrade those engines by a certain date. Well, the Rice NESHAP required those same engines to install a control device. So the practical matter is that the owners of these engines at area sources would have to install a catalyst, most likely, and then maybe a few months later, a year or two later, have to replace the whole engine. And they wouldn't be allowed to get return on investment for that catalyst that they installed, and that was a problem. So one of the changes that took place for the December 7th change to the regulation was to say that these engines at area sources that are subject to state or local regulations, which I just described, our stationary diesel ATCM, they are only subject to management practices until they meet the state or local turnover date for that engine. Well, in order to take advantage of this, you have to report by March 3rd. So technically the regulation doesn't take effect until sometime in April, but yet you should report your intention of not putting a catalyst on that engine and just upgrading it to a Tier 3 or Tier 4 engine when our stationary ATCM requires you to do so. And then any changes to a previously submitted notification. So if you send in, we're going to go over the requirements of a notification, but one of the requirements is that you have to describe the responsible person that's preparing and submitting the report. Well, if that person leaves and somebody comes in, you have 15 days to make that change. And I've done a lot of site visits. Some of the people that run these sites have been there forever and in all likelihood will be there forever. And in some places, the person's been there for the last 30 days. And before that, there hasn't been a compliance officer there for months. So you need some type of succession plan to make sure that we keep EPA updated, or your administrator updated, to any significant changes within 15 days that those changes occur. Compliance status. So we already went over this. 60 days following a compliance requirement for a performance test. and 30 days for compliance requirements that don't require a performance test. And here's the thing, we talked about semi-annual tests versus annual tests earlier. What the rule considers a semi-annual test is the period between January 1 and June 30 is one period, and then obviously July 1 through the end of December is the second period. So you have 30 days to submit your report in terms of your compliance status. So you have until the end of July for the first period or the end of January for the second period. Now think about that. When is your notification for a performance test due? 60 days before the performance test. And then how many days do you have to submit that performance test? So you have to kind of time this stuff to where you're inside of the compliance period and that you're going to be able to get that final report to them by the date that's required, whether it be the end of July, the end of January. So here's the information for the reports and notifications. Obviously everything that describes your company, name, corporate information, address, the responsible office, including a statement from that responsible officer saying that everything I'm submitting is true and accurate, the report date, and also a description of the report period, whether it's an annual test, semi-annual test, June or January through June or July through December. Malfunctions, the number, the duration, a brief description, actions taken to minimize emissions and to correct the malfunction. And then if there are no deviations, a statement saying, hey, life is good, there was no deviations. If you have a SEMS or CPMS out of control, or that wasn't out of control, we have a question, I'm sorry.
How far up the chain you have to go for a responsible person? Is that something like a VP or could it be down lower, or where is that?
I do not remember reading that anywhere in the general provisions. I know for other rules that ARB says it has to be an officer of a certain level. It has to be a corporate officer or their designee. But I don't remember reading anything in the general provisions that describes this person. And in that, let's be blunt. It covers all sources, area sources. And some area sources, who's the compliance officer? It's the office manager or the administrator, whoever it is. So I'm not really sure it has to be this big corporate office. So I don't know. To answer your question, I just don't know. So CPMS and CEMS out of controls. If you have out of control situations, there's a lot of reporting, how long, what you did to correct them. But if there are no out of control situations, that has to be part of your report or notification that there were no out of control instances with our SEMS or CPMS. And the fuel reports, this is back to the landfill digester gas, is 10% of the heat derived from landfill or digester gas. Records, what must you keep? Everything we've just described. All of your notifications, all documentation relative to malfunctions, performance tests and evaluations, maintenance of controls and monitoring equipment, SEMS and CPMS, fuel usage if you're using landfill digester gas, all your maintenance records for your operation of your RICE, and hours of operations for those engines that have operating limitations, emergency engines, limited use engines, engines used less than 24 hours per year. How long do you have to keep your records? 5 years. Now, this is kind of strange. Well, maybe it's not strange. I don't read too much into this. Quad Z specifically says 5 years, and there's a pretty old FAQ. Somebody says, hey, I have a remote engine. You don't expect me to keep records out in the middle of this cornfield, do you? And the FAQ says no, as long as they're readily available for expeditious review. I love that term. Readily available for expeditious review. So the FAQ says that. But when you go read the records retention requirement in the general provision, it says 5 years and 2 years on site. Now, in the big scheme of things, is this a big issue? We keep electronic records. We keep them on our Google Documents or our cloud server. Wherever you go, you just whip out your phone and say, hey, look at all the records you want. You can just pull them down. But just make sure that you can provide records in a readily accessible, expeditious manner, and it shouldn't be an issue. Yeah?
For NSPS in regional levels, I have seen the reporting format. Is there anything similar for RICE? For NSPS, reporting format, regional level, something is available. Is this something for RICE there?
So the question is that for the NSPS at the regional level, there's a format for reporting. Is there anything equivalent for RICE? I'm going to show you the TTN website here in a second, that has samples of notifications. I'm not sure if it has samples of reports. I don't remember seeing samples of reports, but it does have samples of notifications. And that takes us to the NSPS, and this will take us right to the end where we can show you hopefully a couple of examples. So the NSPS is broken into two groups. It's still Title 40, but it's Part 60, Subpart Quad I for compression ignited engines, Subpart Quad J for spark ignited engines. And unlike the Rice NESHAP that focused in on HAPs, hazardous air pollutants, the NSPS focuses on criteria gas, carbon monoxide, volatile organic compounds in the form of hydrocarbons, and oxides of nitrogen. So first we're going to take a look at the section Quad I that applies to compression ignited engines. It applies to two groups. Number one, the manufacturers of compression ignited engines, and secondarily, the owners and operators of compression ignited engines. What it says for the manufacturers is that manufacturers of engines less than 30 liters per cylinder need to manufacture certified engines. Now, on one hand, this isn't a big deal. Oftentimes, not all the times, but oftentimes, especially for engines less than 30 liters per cylinder, they'll manufacture an engine, and that engine can either be used for stationary use or it can be used for what they call non-road use, off-road use. So there's a good likelihood they were already certifying these engines anyways. So it's just kind of harmonizing those two differences of engines and bringing them into one. Then it says for owners and operators of these engines that were constructed after the 11th of July of 2005 and manufactured after the 1st of April of 2006, or it could have been July of 2006 for fire pump engines, or modified or constructed after the 11th of July of 05. What's the definition of a new or reconstructed engine at an area source? June 12, 2006. What are these compliance dates? Yeah, so far we're pretty good. Okay, so what they're demanding, these certified engines are tiered engines. And for non-road engines here in the United States, we have 4 tiers. How many tiers do we have? I love working for the government. 4 tiers means 6. We have Tier 0 engines, which legally aren't engines. These were the engines manufactured before emission standards were applied to engines. Then the first attempt at manufacturing engines that comply with emission standards were Tier 1 engines. And Tier 1 engines, you just can't say by model year or horsepower. They're grouped different model years and different horsepowers. It's more challenging to clean up smaller engines and very large engines, so that's why there's an inconsistency between model years and horsepowers. Then as technology provided and the technology became available to make the engines even cleaner, we went to Tier 2. And then a few years later, more technology became available, we went to Tier 3. And then a few years later, the government came out and said, hey, we need Tier 4. Tier 4 engines are the cleanest engines for both particulate matter and oxides of nitrogen. Well, if you know anything about engines, and we talk a lot about this in our IC engine class, anything you do inside the combustion chamber to lower particulate matter increases NOx. And anything you do inside the combustion chamber to decrease NOx increases particulate matter. So the manufacturers came back and said, oh, EPA and ARB, this is not economically and feasible for us. We can't do this. So we have Tier 4 interim. Tier 4 interim are the cleanest engines for particulate matter. Oftentimes, especially for those mid-range engines, they'll have something called a diesel particulate filter. And then when we get Tier 4 final should be here somewhere around 2014. They'll be the cleanest engines for both oxides of nitrogen and particulate matter. So some engines will use a DPF, diesel particulate filter, and a selective catalytic reduction system. Some engines will just use a selective catalytic reduction system and control PM by leaning out the mixture inside the combustion chamber. So that's what this regulation requires, is that stationary engines adhere to the same tier specifications applied to non-road engines. For engines equal to or greater than 30 liters per cylinder, these are really, really big engines, they're going to fall under the Marines engine standards. So it's not the same certification process as a certificate of conformity for a non-road engine. But these really large engine, what they're anticipating the requirement to be would be a selective catalytic reduction system for NOx. So it ultimately uses ammonia, but It might get ammonia from an ammonia tank, or it might get ammonia from something called a urea tank, and it'll probably use some type of electrostatic participator, like a room deionizer that'll capture the PM and prevent it from going off the stack. So the requirement for engine manufacturers is starting 2007 and later, they have to produce certified engines, with the exception of fire pump engines. Fire pump engines are engines that are usually used in buildings with sprinkler systems, and they're going to provide the water pressure that's going to put out the fire. Those are obviously very sensitive engines because you don't want any malfunctions going on those engines. So they're very reticent about applying new technology to those engines until the technology is very proven. So it's 2007 and later for these compression ignited engines. What's the definition of a new or reconstructed engine for area sources? Oh. So now we have a little bit of a gap there. So this is a good rule, and it's pretty harmonized with the Rice NESHAP, but it's not a perfect harmony between the two. Fire pump engines, again, because they're cautious about applying new technology, they'll be phased in between 2008 and 11, so that gap gets even wider with those fire pump engines. What these engines require is a certificate of conformity. What's happening in the industry is this. Engine manufacturers are taking Tier 3 engines. Those are the engines manufactured before the very, very stringent PM standards that are applied to Tier 4 interim engines. Well, these engine manufacturers are taking these Tier 3 engines and putting a non-OEM, a non-original equipment manufactured diesel particulate filter on them and calling them certified engines. They're not. If you don't have a certificate of conformity from the United States Environmental Protection Agency, signed by whatever officer was in place at the time, you do not have a certified engine. So be very, very cautious when you're buying this engine. Make sure you see that it has a valid certificate of conformity. So here's what compliance looks like. For 07 and later engines, only purchase certified engines. And if it happens to be a fire pump engine, 08 to 011, depending on the size of the engine and when it's phased in. If you buy a certified engine and you install, configure, and use that engine as the manufacturer designed, no further requirements are necessary. You're good to go. But if you decide to change the way you use that engine or how it's configured from the way the manufacturer recommended, now you're going to be subject to performance testing. Yeah?
Coming back to the definition of commencement of construction, if someone purchases an older engine like a model 2000 engine or something and installed the appropriate controls on it, the CI and DPS and everything, and got it to a very critical level, they installed it at 2011, for example, where would that engine fit? Would that fit into the right feature or would that fit into the NSPS?
Well, first of all, what I heard is that someone takes an older engine and they're going to upgrade it to a new standard. So how does that fit into the NSPS or how does that fit into the Rice NESHAP? In terms of complying with the Rice NESHAP, for a new engine, they only have numeric emission limits at major sources for the larger engines. So as long as that engine conforms to the numeric emission limits, they're good to go. Where it becomes a problem is under the NSPS for some engines at major sources and all engines at area sources. They're saying right here they're requiring a certified engine. So and you're going to see right now but if you put in a non-certified engine, even though it meets the emission limits, you're going to be subject to further performance testing. Some of them are just going to be initial, some of them are going to be initial and either semi-annual or annual.
Just to clarify, I mean, someone installs like a purchases a 2000 engine and brings it to a stationary source at your site, installs all these controls on it after 2006, July, whatever it is. Would that in effect not be, requirements, the Rice NESHAP requirements would not apply to that engine, just to implement the NSPS standard?
So I understand they installed the control systems. I think the scenario was this. They bring a 2000 engine to a stationary source. Before or after June 12, 2006? Before or after? After. After June 12, 2006, and it's an area source, it's going to be a new or reconstructed engine. The cost of those control devices do not count towards the cost of reconstruction. So if it's a used engine, they just moved it from one location to the other, it's not even a new source, it's an existing engine. I think that's what I heard in your question.
So essentially the Rice NESHAP will apply to that one?
The Rice NESHAP, because it's an existing engine. It's a 2000 engine, right? And it doesn't fall under the definition of reconstruction because moving an engine does not fall under that definition. So it's an existing engine at an area source.
You didn't move it, purchased it from some manufacturer.
That's moving it. That's the situation I gave you earlier, is they bought a used engine from a franchisee of a major worldwide manufacturer. And they moved it from the store that it was at to their location to have it installed. And the EPA Region 9 said that's not reconstruction, that's just moving an engine. Yeah.
I have a combined few questions. One is comparing NSPS and RISE. So mass emission limits for NSPS for measurements should be reported as a mass emission per brake horsepower hour, but RISE is in a concentration based like ppm. Is that correct observation?
I'm not aware that's a correct observation. If you look at the way you measure emissions, the question has to be how are emissions measured and calculated under the NSPS versus the RICE NESHAP. There are some differences, but you have to look, you have multiple choices depending on what the numeric emission limits are on your engine and how your engine's configured. And so when you go to tables 3 and 4, I think, they point to multiple EPA and non-EPA test methods, and it's going to depend on whether it's a concentration limitation or if it's a percent reduction. It might be a different method if you're using a catalyst as opposed to not using a catalyst. It's going to be a different method whether you're subject to a SEMS or CPMS requirement as opposed to a non-SEMS or CPMS requirement.
We are reporting concentrations, not mass emissions. That's right. So RICE we are reporting concentration.
It's part per million.
Yeah, but for NSPS, you have to report mass emissions, like grams.
Well, in NSPS, if you use a certified engine, you're not reporting any emissions.
No, if it's not certified engine.
If it's a non-certified engine, you're subject to a source test. Well, most likely, depends on the situation. You're subject to a source test, and then the source test, depending on the engine, the general provisions would dictate what type of test it gets. And I don't know what they are off the top of my head.
And the second question is, can we report the total hydrocarbons as target for VOC for NSPS?
I don't know. I don't know. So as long as you install it, configure it, maintain it per the manufacturer specifications, then no performance testing is requiring. If you deviate from that, performance testing is required. Here's the thing with fire pumps. So engines not required to be certified, including that gap of fire pumps because they're being phased in at a later date. You have options. If for some reason you have to put in a non-certified engine, or you're looking at a non-certified engine, the first thing you can do is look around for a certified engine. Just because one manufacturer doesn't have a certified engine for your application doesn't mean another one doesn't. Because again, oftentimes they're going to use non-road engines that are certified for stationary applications. Another option you have is to record performance testing of a similar engine. So if you know of somebody who tested an engine, you have some type of validated data, or if you have a big operation where you're buying multiple engines, you can test one engine and use that test data for multiple engines. The other thing is the engine manufacturer very likely has emissions data. So ask them, even though it's not a certified engine, there's still a good likelihood that they're going to have emission data for it. And you also might want to talk to the control device manufacturer. When we verify devices like diesel particulate filters here in California, they send these engines off to the Southwest Institute in Texas, and they do baseline tests because the criteria applied to level 3 devices is an 85% reduction. Well, the way you calculate an 85% reduction is to know what your base reading was before the control device. So the control device manufacturer might have that data, and if nothing else, you're just going to have to perform an initial performance test to it to establish what the emissions of that non-certified engines are. For engines greater than 30 liters per cylinder, they're not required to be certified. There are standards for marine engines, but they're not the typical certificate of conformity like we see for non-road engines. So you have to do initial performance test, annual performance tests for non-emergency engines, and continuously monitor operating parameters. That's the CMOS that they mention in this rule. Reporting, record keeping, and monitoring. No job is done until the paperwork is complete. Emergency engines, obviously we're going to keep copious records from a non-resettable hour meter. DPF equipped engines, diesel particulate filters, you have to have a back pressure monitor and you have to document corrective actions. I told you earlier about catalysts, they're flow-through devices. Diesel particulate filters are wall flow devices. For the exhaust gases to get out of the engine and out the tip of the stack, they have to pass through a seemingly solid wall. Actually has microscopic pores in it, but they're much more likely to plug and increase the exhaust back pressure. So anytime you have a back pressure event from normal loading that requires regeneration, abnormal loading because of a malfunction or neglected maintenance, or periodic ash removal from the collection of non-combustible ash inside the filter, you have to keep records of this. And the non-emergency engines between 3,000 horsepower up to greater than 10 liters per cylinder, and non-emergency engines less than 07, which are non-certified engines, we have the requirement of initial notifications, records and notifications of maintenance, engine certification, and records of compliance demonstrations. That's it for CI data. We're almost out of time, but let's see if we can squeeze in some spark-ignited information. Spark-ignited information is very similar to the compression-ignited information, but unfortunately they just did not do the statement that says from 2007 and later, all engines shall be certified. They went to them and said certain groups of engines have to be certified starting in July 1st, 2008. So engines equal to or less than 25 horsepower, and then only engines greater than 25 horsepower that are run off gasoline and rich burn gaseous engines. And these engines, certification means they have a certificate of conformity. The spark-ignited engine manufacturers are allowed to, they have the option of certifying other engines, which is attractive to you. It'll get them more customers because just like compression-ignited engines, there's less requirements for certified engines. So who does it apply to? Not only the engine manufacturers, but the owners and operators. And one of the requirements is that you have to use what the standard sulfur content of California gas is, which is equal to or less than 80 parts per million. And then if you use certified engines, as long as they're installed, configured, and operated as per the manufacturer specifications, you're good to go. When not using manufacturer specified or certified engines, or if you're not using the engine as the way the engine manufacturer specified, you have to keep maintenance plans and records consistent with good air pollution practices. Engines between 100 and 500 horsepower, initial performance test. Greater than 500 horsepower, we have to do initial and subsequent tests too. Emergency engines that don't meet non-emergency standards, non-resettable hour meters, pretty much all emergency engines need those. And then if it's equal to or less than 100 hours a year, 50 of which can be used for non-emergency purposes. Right now, they don't allow peak shaving or demand response. There is some mention, maybe Dustin knows what it is, about harmonizing that with the Rice NESHAP, the spark-ignited NSPS.
For if it's used in demand response? Yes, there is a very long description of how you fall into that category. It's part of the amendments, and it is being revised in both the NSPS 4J and the NESHAP 4Z. So once those amendments are all out, it'll come out. And pretty much what it is you can participate in the plan if it meets the requirements of what they consider, I think it's a demand response plan level 2 event. There's a lot of information on what you have to do to qualify. But if you do that, you can operate up to 15 hours per year, keep records, but you don't have to notify anybody per the NSPS or NESHAP. But if you exceed the 15 hours per year, then that's when you're going to need to submit an annual report to the EPA to let them know this is the plan you participated in, here's the information on why you operated, and additional information like that.
Now, I just did that to test Dustin, see if he was paying attention, and he passed with flying colors. That was amazing. Good job. Record keeping very similar to compression-ignited engines. So this is what we talked about today, the background behind the Rice NESHAP, all the regulatory requirements one by one. We did an overview of the IC, NSPS, and now a real quick tour of compliance. What EPA does is they maintain a website. Let's see if I have it here. It's called the TTN Network, Technology Transfer Network. This has everything, including all of my messages. Well, I get a lot of messages, don't I? One of my kids must really want to talk to me. They obviously need money. It's the beginning of the semester. They always need money. So it's all the different rules. Why do you need to know about the 2004 rule or the 2008 rule? Because if you fell under that rule, you had requirements under there, and someone could theoretically come back and say, hey, were you in compliance with the rule back then? So even when you look up the different regulations on the CFR website, they'll give you all the different rules back through time. They give you the history.
This is only for 5 years, right? Once you go
Record keeping's for 5 years, yes.
If you open
You
up
have
some
to
of those
maintain them
rules,
for 5 and continually.
if you open up some of those rules that you just showed,
Uh-huh.
this rule, it's only going to show the amendments. It's not going to show the old rule. You have to go to the older rule.
Oh, it's
to get the rule.
tough.
You don't get
Yeah,
the
they
whole
don't make
rule
these
when
things
you,
easy.
when you.
Oh, that's the tough part. Because what I try to do is I try to put together the cleanest set of regulations to put this class together. It is really, really challenging. You're cut and pasting, and then you're all paranoid. You're not cut and pasting correctly. It's very, very challenging. One of the good news is that they've published the rule now. So let's see if it's here. As of 1/14/13, they have the summary of comments. So we have some updated technical information. Let's see what the rule is. Not yet published. It says final, but not yet published.
It went in today. It went in this morning. It was on the Federal Register.
So maybe it'll show up this afternoon or tomorrow. So all the different versions of the rule, all kinds of compliance information, frequently asked questions, fact sheets. But the place I want to take you real quick is a regulation navigation type operation. It's going to ask you questions about your situation. As long as you answer with good, valid, accurate information, you'll get good, valid, accurate information back. But you know the adage, garbage in results in garbage out. So make sure you know the dates that engines were put in place so you can answer these questions correctly. So this gives you some background on how to use this navigation tool, gives you some definitions. It tells you have to know what the definitions are. First question, do you own or operate a stationary engine? Answer is yes. So far we're doing good. Second question, is your engine being tested at a stationary RICE test cell stand? If you're not an engine manufacturer, that engine is no. Does your facility have the potential to emit 10 tons or more? Since we're area people, we're going to say no. That's differentiating between a major and an area source. You are an area source. Did you begin construction or reconstruction on your stationary engine before June 12, 2006? If I say no, what's going to happen? What requirements do you have under the RICE NESHAP? For area sources, none. Major sources have requirements, but area sources don't have any. So I'm going to say yes, we started construction before June 12th. Is your existing stationary engine more than 500 horsepower? Let me pick an engine here. We will pick a 4-stroke lean burn, so we'll say yes. Okay, what is your existing area source 500 horsepower engine category? I'm going to go with a spark-ignited 4-stroke lean burn that operates 24 hours or less. Nope.
Non-emergency, 4-stroke. Where is it?
I don't know.
More than. Right there.
Here, right here?
Yep.
That's Richburg.
More than.
Where's the Lincoln?
It's 2. Oh, scroll down. There's a scroll bar.
Ah, there it is.
Yeah, there you go.
That was close.
There he is.
Okay, now it gives you a hyperlink. Now that we have this hyperlink, we click on the hyperlink. Hopefully my PDF on my laptop works. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. And it's going to extract out all the sections of the regulation that apply to you. Here's the thing. He says nice, and it is nice. It's still a tough read of a regulation. I've worked with different organizations. Whenever I come to tour them, I'm asking them to teach me everything they know about their engines and complying with the rule. The thing they ask me is to help them put together compliance strategies for their rules, which I really don't do, but I show them how to do this. And what many of them do is they have to create an individual packet for every engine. Because again, there's so many differences between the different engines and how the engine's used, emergency, non-emergency. It's like a separate individual standalone compliance strategy for each individual engine. And initially that's kind of tough to comprehend, especially if you have a lot of engines. But unless you have a better way of doing it, once you resign yourself to that methodology, that's pretty much what it requires. Yeah?
Are they going to update this with the revisions?
Yes. So my first thing is I wanted an updated cheat sheet for this class. And Melanie assured me that they are working diligently to get all the implementation information. Here's their theory, though, and it's hard to argue with this, is they have 60 days from the day it's published. So they're using all that time to do that. So it might be over the period of the next 60 days. And if you saw all the information on here, there's a lot of things to update in terms of FAQs, cheat sheets, navigation tools, so on and so forth.
Can we address to get to this again?
It is on the presentation, so let's go back to the presentation. Oh, I didn't get to it yet.
Your handout's missing that.
Oh, okay.
You're kidding.
It doesn't have that.
All right, well, here it is.
Shut down.
We shorted you a page. Unbelievable.
The most important.
Actually, if you ever do a Google search for Rice NESHAP, it takes you right there. Look at this. 12 o'clock on the dot.